Taxation is theft.
Taxes are a bill the government charges you. So why do you have to do all the math?
Big government sucks.
They are tired of being taxed to death.
Please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms.
I think that all government is a waste of taxpayer money.
Some people might think you're paying over to the government.
First of all, income tax is illegal.
I want to know what you're doing with my fucking tax money.
You don't actually think they spend $20,000 on a hammer, $30,000 on a toilet seat, do you?
If you think that the Capitol will ever treat us fairly, you are lying to yourself.
I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
I just don't want to be another piece of their cake.
I'm going to show these people what you don't want them to see.
We're a $2.6 trillion enterprise, and we've never been audited.
We cannot rely on the federal government.
Maybe the media is manipulating you.
It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
I've got one that can see.
Government is inefficient and should be dissolved.
The entire government will be shut down until further notice.
Slash it. Slash it.
I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about the miserable, screwed up world of local government.
Had your kids, had your wife, and had your husband because they raping everybody out here.
Government totally sucks, you motherfucker. It is all around us. You can see it when you turn on your television, when you pay your taxes.
Sorry, but I don't do taxes.
I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
The government is a greedy piglet that suckles on a taxpayer's teat until they have sore, chapped nipples.
Triple the taxes.
This is an IRS agent's dream.
The roads. Is that the best you can do? I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. And I'm all out of bubblegum. I'm as mad as hell. I am not going to take this anymore.
All right, everyone. Welcome back. Hey, wouldn't be an event if we didn't get a little bit sidetracked from time to time. It wouldn't be a live event if things didn't happen that cause us to have to think on our feet, which is easier for some than it is for others. I'd like to think that these guys that put this event together, I'm just going to go ahead and throw it out there. These guys that put this event together, the Taxation is best organization. Man, I have been super impressed with working with these guys. So what you guys have put together for these 2 days has been really fantastic. I hope you, the viewer, I hope those of you that have tuned in and watched alongside us live have enjoyed the adventure as much as we have. I also hope that if you're watching this now, or you're watching this 20 years from now, that you're learning something, that you're picking some stuff up, that it's still some kind of value to you. Maybe not. Maybe 20 years from now, society is going completely libertarian and everybody's just cool, right? Nobody's hitting each other, nobody's taking each other's stuff. Everyone's just minding their own business. How nice is that? It's interesting. We talked a little bit about we've talked a lot about a lot today, and now I think we're going to get into some of the arts. We'll talk a little bit about some of the artistic contributions that go into liberty and freedom. One of the things that I was just talking about, I'm a musician. And one of the things I was just talking about with some of my musician friends, remotely, of course, because we're all still social distancing, so to speak. But just talking about how there's kind of a lack of those freedom streaming musicians, those kind of folks that are those musicians that are iconic for railing against the government, so to speak. Maybe they got wise after seeing what happened to some of the ones that come before them. But today, for Taxation is Theft Fest 2020, we want to introduce you guys to a musician who goes by the name. His name is Low Fuzz, and Low Fuzz is quite an entertainer. If you have a chance, go out and check him out. But he's been providing the connection between human emotion and experience and the healing power of music, along with stories of love and empowerment. He really is he has some things to say, and he's worth listening to. So Low Fuzz, he does sing the anthem for the legalization of cannabis, the 420 is what I think it's called, if I remember correctly. So he's one of us, ladies and gentlemen. He's one of us. So if you want to throw your support out there, you want to throw some support in the ways of somebody that thinks like us, that's maybe out in the artistic community, definitely check out Low Fuzz. And we're going to share with you a little playlist today, some of his tunes. And we want to hope you enjoy it. So stay with us and kick back, relax. And if you're on the East Coast in 10 minutes, we'll be talking. Anyway, enjoy the playlist. So if you guys want to go ahead and bring that up, I think I'm ready. Yeah, and it looks like you're ready. Here we go. Enjoy, folks.
Thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal trees and the birds, the ocean and the sky, the grass and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. Well, I had a long day at the office. I did a little running for my health. Tired and sore with the side of stress. Now it's time for some medicine and rest. So thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean and the sky, the grass and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. I tossed and turned the other night. My mind was working overtime, thinking about my problems and my heartache and my troubles. I smoked a bowl and made it alright. So thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean and the sky, the grass and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean, the sky, the grass and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. Well, I had a great idea. I lit a joint and I puffed away. My pen started writing and the words kept coming, and I'm singing it to you today. So thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean, the sky, the grass, and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean, the sky, the grass and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. Waking and baking, shaking and hopping, twisting and turning, choking and burning. It's a fine life. Yeah, this is a fine life. Beauty, clarity, health and happiness. Come talk with me. Love's and man crying, tears from the laughing, all around stash. Dancing and a loving on high. I'm high. shaking and a hopping, twisting and a turning, choking and a burning. It's a fine life. This is a fine life. Beauty, clarity, health and happiness. Come talk with me. Loving and crying, tears from a laughing all around the mess. Dancing and a rubbing, I'm high. I'm high. Living, breathing, loving, fucking. Everybody join in. I'm high. I'm high. My sweet joy, how you comfort me, my only remedy. My sweet baby, joy eternal, physically, physically. You are so good to me. Yes, indeed. You comfort me. I need you, please, to comfort me. My sweet joy, you're so lovely. You're so pretty. My sweet baby, you show me amazing things. Like this moment, you are so good. You're so good. You're so good to me. Yes, indeed. You comfort me. I need you, please. Comfort. My sweet joy, you're so lovely. You're so pretty. You're so pretty. My sweet baby, you show me amazing things. company. I need the place to company. I need you with me. I need you with me. To company, to company, to company, oh, company, to company, oh, 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 the company, your company.
Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. Now, who wants a shirt? Do me a favor. Please like and subscribe. Press the button. Hit the bell so you can hear when I release a new video. Ding. Thank you very much.
I'm going to change. I'm a person needing you. And your mothers and your fathers, your aunts and uncles, your cousins too. Because I need you, and I want you. Because I love you, and I feel you. Because I need you, and I want you. Because I love you, and I feel you. I said that you told me, but I didn't see you. Now that you're gone, you know my heart's going to. Because I need you, and I want you. Because I love you, and I approve you. Because I need you, and I want you. Because I love you, and I approve you. Well, not for me. This is so insecure. Because I pray every day that I'll be where you. I want Cause I love you.
Lo-Fuzz, find me on YouTube, where you can find the anthem for legalization of marijuana. Yes, that is the truth. It goes like this, guys. It goes, I thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town, San Antonio. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean, the sky, the grass, and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean and the sky, the grass and the blood. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. Well, I had a long day at the office. You know, I did a little running for my health. I was tired and sore with the tired and stress. Now it's time for some medicine and rest. So thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean and the sky, the grass and the blood. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. I tossed and turned the other night. My mind, it was working all overtime. I was thinking about my problems and my heartache and my troubles. I smoked a bowl and made it alright. So thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean and the sky, the grass and the earth. I think I'll be making marijuana legal in my state. Think I'll be making marijuana legal in my county. I think I'll be making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean, the sky, the grass and the blood. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. I had a great idea. I lit a joint and I puffed away. My pen started writing down, the words kept coming. Now I'm singing it to you today. So thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean, the sky, the grass, and the birds. Marijuana legal in my state. Marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. Thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the sky, the grass and the blood. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. Thank you guys. Thank you very much. Yes. That's how I feel in my heart every morning when I smoke my medicine indoors. Here we come, legalization 2020. That's what I believe. That's why I'm here. I'll put a spell on you. Cause you're mine. Stop the things that you're doing. You think I'm lying? I'ma prove it. I ain't lying. Can't stand when you're running around. I can't stand when you're texting around. Put a spell on you. Cause you're mine. Stop the things you do. Still think I'm lying? Prove it to you. I ain't lying. That's why. I love you. I love you. If you don't want me, because I'm yours right now, I'll put a spell on you. Cause you're mine. Because you're mine. Thank you guys, I appreciate it. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean and the sky, the grass and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. Well, I had a long day at the office. I did a little running for my health. Tired and sore with the side of stress. Now it's time for some medicine and rest. So thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean and the sky, the grass and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. I tossed and turned the other night. My mind was working overtime, thinking about my problems and my heartache and my troubles. I smoked a bowl and made it alright. So thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean and the sky, the grass and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I
marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean, the sky, the grass and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. Well, I had a great idea. I lit a joint and I puffed away. My pen started writing and the words kept coming, and I'm singing it to you today. So thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean, the sky, the grass and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my county. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my town. I thank God for the rain, for the trees and the birds, the ocean, the sky, the grass and the bud. I thank God for making marijuana legal in my state.
Well, what do you know about that, ladies and gentlemen? I hope you enjoyed Low Fuzz and his creative stylings for us. He had some catchy tunes, I thought. I did some toe tapping, I did some head bobbing, I did some fist pumping. Like, yeah, right on, man. It must be great to be that excited to have cannabis legalized in your county to sit down and write a song about it. That's inspiration at its finest, folks. Messing around with that jazz cabbage will do that to you, though. Get you creative juices flowing. For some folks, it makes you completely worthless. Makes you not want to do anything. But everyone's different, right? And I think that's what it comes down to. The whole liberty movement is respecting our differences, right? And understanding that, hey, what works for you is for you. But if it doesn't impact me, by all means, do you, man. Do what you got to do. Do what you enjoy to do. As long as you're not impeding on my rights and my ability to do what I want to do, then we're all good, man. Don't hurt people. Don't take their stuff. I think that's all good words to live by. From a musician's perspective, I enjoyed watching Lil Fuzz there play his jams. They got into some nice little jam sessions there. Kind of got lost in the music a little bit, came back around. I pointed out some of the videos that we saw and the snapshots of the playing in the corner in the bar and playing on a stage where there's no people in front of it. Welcome to being a local musician, ladies and gentlemen. That's where it starts. It's not like you just wake up one day and all of a sudden you're Tool, right? It's not like you just wake up one morning and you're the biggest YouTube sensation there is. Well, for some that happens, I guess, but you got to work on it. You got to put in your time. You got to put in the time and the effort and get out there, and you got to be relatable. People got to like you. So I was trying to do some research here to see where Lil Fuzz is based out of, and I was going to tell you folks in that area to go out and support him, but I think this is going to be true in any marketplace once we reopen, and more now than ever. Once everything starts to reopen, these bands, the comedians, the artists that are performing for you folks in the nightclubs and the bars, putting on local shows for you every week. You got to get out there and support those folks, man. They do it for you. They do it for obviously for the joy of creating art, but they really do it for you. So get out and show some support. For some musicians and entertainers, comedians, that's how they've chosen to support their families or to support themselves. So they really need you to get out there and show some support. So, man, I hope you guys are enjoying Taxation is Theft Fest as much as I am. I'm having a great time. All the speakers, track A, track B, day one, day two, man, it's all just firing on all cylinders for us here. We're having a great time on the back end, on the inside. I hope you guys out there in the world of the interweb are having a great time and enjoying this as much as we're enjoying putting it on for you and sharing what we've built with you. It means a lot to us that you're here. It means a lot to us that you're sticking with it. It's a long festival, you know, but it's worth it, and it's certainly worth the price of admission. Right? Can't beat that. Yeah, enjoy, right? Because we feel like this knowledge needs to be in the hands of people, right? Power to the people. It's time for us to stop. Yeah, it's time for us to stop. Just stop them. Make them stop. It's become too big, too intrusive, and it's time for the government to see its way out. Right? It's time for us as citizens of the United States and liberty-minded people. It's time for us to continue to spread our message, be loud and proud about it, and continue to get out there. So we got a few more hours left. Tit Fest, ladies and gentlemen, and those of you that are paying attention, I think that's the first time I've referred to it as Tit Fest. That's all right. Just proof that my wife is the coolest wife in the world. When I told her that I was hosting Tit Fest for 2 days straight this weekend, she said, "Okay, have a good time." She didn't even ask. So that's how cool my wife is. Anyway, folks, stay tuned. We're coming up at the top of the hour. We're going to be talking to, let's see who's coming up at the top of the hour here. We've got, I lost it. There's my schedule. Oh, my man Zach Foster's coming up at the top of the hour. Super excited to talk to him, see what he has to bring to the table. He's going to talk to us a little bit from an international perspective of being a libertarian and what's going on around the world. So stay tuned, stick around, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. Peace. back, ladies and gentlemen. You know, one of the hardest things about this online entertainment stuff is the lack of eye contact with an audience, right? So I was thinking about that here, how we have a tendency to watch ourselves in the cameras without staring actually at the camera and making direct eye contact with the people we're talking to. It's interesting. Next time you're watching an online entertainment where somebody's entertaining you online, pay attention to that. And you'd be surprised how disturbing it can be to have a conversation or to have somebody talking to you without actually making direct contact with you. Anyway, welcome back. That's your words of wisdom from your old Uncle Scott at the top of the hour, 4 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time. Super glad you guys are here. Looks like we've got some visitors from Uganda turning in. Love it. You guys, I'm super excited to hear from our next guest, Mr. Zach Foster. He is the executive director of the Mises Mambi Institute of Cuba. He is, for 3 years, he's helped get vital resources and a voice to libertarians behind the Iron Curtain in Cuba and in Venezuela. He also does Hispanic outreach in the Libertarian Party here at home. So, Mr. Foster, Zach, are you with us today?
Hello, hello.
Yes, hello. Welcome to Taxation is Theft Fest 2020. Thank you for being here.
I'm incredibly glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. So I look forward to hearing from what you have to say today. I will step back. These folks get tired of hearing me talk all day, right? So I'm going to step back. I'll give you a chance to kind of introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what you'd like to talk about, and then I'll keep an eye on questions in the chat. So if anything comes up, I'll let you know. But for now, the screen is yours.
Good deal. All right, so hello, everybody. Thank you to all of you who are watching. I'm Zach Foster, and as our wonderful host said, I'm the executive director of the Mises Mambi Institute of Cuba. What is the Mises Mambi Institute of Cuba? It is Cuba's Mises Institute. Just like we have a Ludwig von Mises Institute of Economics here in the United States, and we have Mises Institutes that are based in other countries, same thing's going on with the Cubans. They've had a small Mises group there for over 5 years now, and over time it developed to become an actual Mises Institute in and of itself, except Cuba's Mises Institute, which is partially run in Cuba and partially run here in the United States, is kind of a hybrid because we don't just do economic theory, we also do incubation of activism. We want to see libertarians going out there and we want to see them educating people in the streets about libertarian ideas, limited governments, free markets. These are obviously things that can be very controversial, if not dangerous, in Cuba. And we also want to see what kind of political action people can make out of the things that they're learning. Are they going out there and are they educating people? Are they getting the attention of the government? Are they preaching that free markets are an antidote to Cuba's economic ills that have been caused by the socialist dictatorship? Well, absolutely. So there has been a Mises group going on in Cuba for several years now, and it's now the Mises Mambi Institute. We do come out with approximately 50 original articles and several other reports and other types of academic scholarship every year. We come out with videos on a pretty frequent basis. Some of them will be videos of activism and education and other libertarian shenanigans that are going on in Cuba or Venezuela, but with English subtitles so that our international English-speaking audiences can know what the hell is going on. And other times it will be English education, but subtitled in Spanish, not just for Cuban libertarians or Venezuelan libertarians, but for the entire Spanish-speaking audience of people who might be looking for libertarian ideas, or they might be doing research about whatever particular topic that we're talking about. Now, this is probably the most mild and the most academic as this talk is going to get, because a lot of this is going to be a roller coaster ride, and some of the information that I tell you might seem mundane, but other bits of information that I have for you guys today is going to be downright disturbing. So grab your drinks, buckle up. The roller coaster ride to hell is just starting. Best way to begin this story, the story of why I'm here telling you guys about all of this, I'm just going to tell you how I got involved in this. I'll call it a rabbit hole. It is absolutely a rabbit hole. And I got sucked into the rabbit hole in February of 2017. So, like I said, there is a Mises group inside of Cuba that has become the Mises Mobby Institute since I got involved. But when I got involved, it was still just a small book club in Havana. And that's really what it was. 5, 6, 7 people meeting inside of a room, inside of somebody's house, with a couple of Spanish language copies of, Theory of Money and Credit. I don't think they even had copies of Human Action. They had a couple of copies of different Murray Rothbard books that somebody from Spain sent them in Spanish. And that was it. They would study these limited ideas, and whenever they could, they would try to go out and find some internet connection so they could research these ideas on the internet and find out more about libertarianism. The growth of the libertarian movement inside of Cuba is definitely a very organic thing that happened of the Cubans, by the Cubans, and for the Cubans, and it just happened to be foreign libertarians like myself who helped out. But back in February of 2017, there were two libertarians, and I say that with a small L, two small L libertarians were arrested by state security in Cuba. State security is the secret police, the political police. If the FBI and the NSA was the same agency, that would be state security in Cuba. And state security was founded by none other than Che Guevara. A lot of leftists have turned him into a symbol of peace and a symbol of love, which is highly ironic because he was actually a lifetime guerrilla fighter who was quite literally dedicated to starting a world war between communist countries and capitalist countries. But after the Cuban Revolutionary War and after the Castro clique came to power, once the communists started consolidating control of the new revolutionary Cuban government, once the Soviet advisors came in, then they started rebuilding Cuban society along the same model as the Soviet Union. So they absolutely had to have a level of Orwellian police spying. And by the way, that does not mean that it doesn't happen here. That does not excuse the activities of the CIA or the NSA. But we're not talking about the NDAA. We're not talking about Homeland Security. We are talking about libertarianism behind the Iron Curtain in communist countries. So Che Guevara founded the state security agency, which locked up these two libertarians. The incident was they were approaching a house in Havana, which is now the location of the Benjamin Franklin Libertarian Library. They have a very modest little library. It looks very much like the one that's behind me, except the walls in that house are pink. And these two people were on their way to a book club meeting in that house when they got stopped by a couple of guys that were dressed in plain clothes. That's actually really common for Cuba because state security likes to go undercover all the time. Now, if you are a Cuban, it's pretty obvious who's a state security guy because really, like, only gangbangers and government agents will just sit there on a Vespa on a street corner watching the same couple of houses all day. There's really only two groups of people in the entire country that do that. And if you have nothing to steal, then it's probably the secret police. So that's what was happening that evening. They got approached by the secret police who demanded these two libertarians show them their ID. One of them, whose name is Ubaldo, he said, "Hey, you're in plain clothes. You have not identified yourself as a police officer. You can pound sand. I'm not showing you shit." So those guys came back later with their badges and also with the National Revolutionary Police, and they arrested these two libertarians. And at first, the trumped up charges were attempted assault of a police officer, but because there were some different witnesses, different neighbors hanging around seeing the event, they couldn't go with those trumped up charges. So the new charges that these guys actually got convicted on was distributing enemy propaganda. Now, don't quote me on this, but I'm almost sure that the books they got caught and arrested with was Spanish translation of Rothbard's Ethics of Liberty. That's what these guys got a criminal conviction for. That was the enemy propaganda. Why is that enemy propaganda? Was it attacking the Castro regime? No, but that book very clearly attacks statism and it attacks socialism. And one important thing is under Cuba's constitution, or the old constitution, because they redid it recently, Article 53 of the last Cuban constitution says that only socialists have freedom of speech, or freedom of speech only exists in keeping with socialist objectives. So what does that really mean? Freedom of speech only exists in what the Cuban Communist Party or the Cuban government decides is acceptable. Obviously, speech, any kind of speech criticizing socialism, or that could be misconstrued as disagreeing or criticizing the Cuban Revolution, it's just plain not allowed. So that's what these guys got criminally charged for, distributing enemy propaganda. One guy got sentenced to a year and a half in prison, and he served his prison sentence in full. The other guy got sentenced to 7 years in a labor prison. The guy who got a year and a half was Manuel Velasquez. The guy who got 7 years was Ubaldo Herrera. 3 years later and 3 months to the day, he is still in a labor prison in Cuba. The way that I got involved was shortly after these guys got arrested, other members of the Mises Cuba book club started showing up to come to the rescue. And by the way, for those of you who are wondering what the Mises Cuba book club has to do with Venezuela, everything goes back to Cuba. So I got to explain this. I'm just going to give you guys a little spoiler right now. The crisis in Venezuela is triggered in part by an ongoing invasion and military occupation by the Cuban government and the armed forces. Literally, everything goes back to Cuba. So the rest of the guys in the Mises Cuba book club started mobilizing after these two guys literally got sentenced to a gulag. They got sent to a labor prison for the high crime of having a Murray Rothbard book. One of them in Havana got on the phone and he called one of his friends who was a refugee who had just recently arrived in Miami. A lot of Cuban refugees to this day will brave 90 miles of shark-infested waters and choppy oceans to try to get to Miami because they believe it is worth it risking their lives just so that they can get over here where there's a higher standard of living, where there's not a Marxist government that squeezes out almost every form of entrepreneurship, where there's not anywhere near the insane level of political persecution that exists in Cuba. Again, I'm not saying that there is no political persecution inside this country, because if there wasn't, then Ross Ulbricht would not still be in prison today. But again, we're not talking about Ross Ulbricht. We're talking about libertarians behind the Iron Curtain. So a gentleman by the name of Nelson from Cuba called his friend, who was also a member of the Mises Cuba book club, but he had finally managed to get himself off the island. He had just arrived in Miami. He was living there as a refugee. His asylum had just barely gotten approved. He still did not speak English. So that guy got onto social media and he started crawling through all these Spanish language libertarian groups on Facebook, desperately searching for somebody, anybody, to pay him a little bit of attention and find out what's going on. At the time, it was early February of 2017. I happened to be posting in the Spanish language groups, and I was looking for some inspiration in the Latin American libertarians because I was personally disappointed not only with the lackluster performance by some of the top staff of the Gary Johnson presidential campaign, but also how so many people in the American libertarian movement who claim to be libertarians at the very last moment allowed themselves to buy into this propaganda of, oh crap, last minute, we got to vote for Donald Trump because Hillary Clinton is going to be communism. Well, I disagreed with that henny penny, the sky is falling attitude. And so I was incredibly disappointed with how many people did that. So I really didn't want to talk to American libertarians at the time. I was kind of cranky and feeling let down by American libertarians. So I felt like taking my ball and going home. And my version of that was saying, screw it, I'm going to talk to the Latin American libertarians. If there is any area of the world that has been absolutely ravaged over the last 50 years, it has been Latin America. That's where people are going to be appreciating libertarian ideas. I'm not going to hang out with you American socialists, So that's how this guy, this refugee, found me. And he messaged me. He blew up my inbox. Help me, my friends, blah, 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 libertarians, blah, 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 arrested by state security, blah, blah, blah. They're in a labor prison. And I'm going, what? What the hell is going on? So again, this guy was explaining to me, blah, blah, blah. My friends got arrested for having libertarian books. They're in a labor prison. Please help me get the word out. This guy was very adamant that we help him get the word out. He was specifically not asking for money. So that's how I eventually got confidence that this was not some kind of a Nigerian prince scam. And he never did ask for money. He really did want some exposure for these libertarians who got sent to the gulag for the high crime of having books critical of socialism. And it's not like in the Ethics of Liberty, Murray Rothbard was going out of his way to attack socialism or socialists. Just the fact that the book disagrees with those political and economic theories is bad enough. And also, with these guys in particular, Cuba does that North Korea thing where if your grandparents were, had bad politics or something like that, or if your great grandparents were landlords, or if your great grandfather was actually a South Korean soldier that got taken POW by the North Koreans and never got released back to South Korea, then for generations, all of those people's relatives would also be treated as second-class citizens. So these guys were a victim of that. Their parents or grandparents did something stupid to piss off the local Communist Party person 60 years ago, and then generations later, state security is watching their kids and their grandkids. That is a reality of life inside of Cuba. So that's how I got involved. These people directly contacted me, came to me, showed me evidence that these libertarians were locked up, and they dropped this whole problem in my lap. And the way that I was raised, when people are in a crisis situation like that, an emergency situation like that, and somebody comes specifically asking you for help, I don't believe that you can just tell that person to pound sand. I firmly believe that you got a responsibility to do something about that. So that was that was the way I felt. I had a responsibility. So I asked one of my friends from the Libertarian Party of Nevada Executive Committee, and my good friend Alexander De Benedetto, who's not in Nevada anymore, but he was part of the XCOM at the time, says, well, I really don't know what to do either, Zach, but I guess we could put out a proclamation, a resolution, something that we could send out to the media and to the wider world, communicating that what's happening here is wrong. And I said, all right, fine, that works. Let's do something. So next thing you know, February of 2017, the Libertarian Party of Nevada was the first Libertarian Party to publish a resolution condemning the Cuban government's arrest of these two libertarians and also demanding that they be released immediately. And then next thing we know, the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire published a similar resolution a couple days later. Then the Libertarian Party of Oklahoma and New Mexico, the Chicago Municipal Libertarian Party. Next thing I know, there were over a dozen different state parties, and then it was being debated. That same resolution was being debated on the LNC. And then the LNC published a resolution a couple of months later saying the same thing, condemning the Cuban government's arrest of these libertarians and calling on their immediate release, and also proclaiming their support for the growing libertarian movement in Cuba. And this was something that was absolutely beautiful, because behind the Iron Curtain of Marxism-Leninism, inside of this very Orwellian country, where it's not only required that you live under socialism, but if you're going to participate in society in any way, shape, or form, you have to play the game and publicly kiss Fidel Castro's ass. And the fact that there was a group of people who were specifically choosing not to do that, but also rejecting this, Miami right-wingism that so many of the Cuban exiles are characterized as subscribing to. This was entirely different. These were people who were not of the left or of the right. They were specifically libertarian, and it was happening inside of a communist country. So absolutely, American libertarians were getting excited about that. I mean, these are ideas that absolutely excite me. Hell, that's why I'm wearing this Rothbard t-shirt. And by the way, if you guys have not been to Rothbard's restaurant and ale house in Connecticut, you absolutely have to go check it out. My shout out to Joe Farrell. Much love to you, brother. Anyway, the more the international community started paying attention to the Cuban libertarian, even to the point where Libertarian Party of Spain was publishing resolutions about what was going on in Cuba, Libertarian Party of Russia, despite their problems and the war that the Putin government is waging against them, they still found time to decry what was happening in Cuba. So this was perhaps the first time that libertarians, capital L libertarians and small L libertarians around the world, consciously came together to try and do something to help our oppressed brothers. And that was, in my opinion, a new moment in the history, a watershed moment in the history of the global libertarian movement, because that showed such a huge paradigm shift from what we were 100 years ago, 130 years ago, Way back when, it was on one end of the world, just the Austrian School of Economics over there in Vienna. It wasn't that many people. And then at the same time, you had people like John Stuart Mill and some of the abolitionists over here. Maybe you had a couple of English Enlightenment era liberals, and that was about it. Nobody had ever made the word libertarian. And then that word came into the lexicon about 100 years ago. But even then, for decades, it was just people writing op-eds in obscure economic journals. It was Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard writing essays about how, you know, the other one sucks more. And next thing you know, the libertarian movement grows exponentially under Ron Paul. That was another watershed moment that many of us were privileged to witness about a decade ago. And then from the Ron Paul revolution to see that these ideas exploded to the point where there were independent Mises groups, not only in Cuba, but also in Latin America. Today, there is a thriving Mises Institute in Venezuela. There are others in Brazil, Peru, Mexico, Russia, other countries. It is absolutely insane. These libertarian ideas are taking off. And the more that the international community started paying attention to what was happening in Cuba, the more the Cuban regime started stepping up their level of repression. I remember one night the libertarians were all holed up in that house where the Ben Franklin Libertarian Library is, and they were calling us American libertarians, furiously blowing up our phones. They were absolutely terrified because the counter-terror police had surrounded the house, and they had cordoned off the streets, and you know, whenever they would peek behind the closed curtains out the windows to see these police officers, they would see guys with combat helmets and bulletproof vests and boots and riot gear and rifles, the whole 9 yards. It was absolutely insane. And this is what libertarians are facing on a regular basis in communist countries. The only libertarians inside the United States I can think of who have ever faced military grade weapons are probably the ballsy people who got involved with the Bundy Ranch rebellions back in 2012 and 2014. You know, those are the only ones I can think of. Maybe somebody's ex-wife, you know, got pissed off and said, "Hey, you know, my ex-husband's got a bunch of guns on the property. He's dangerous." You know, it's few and far between. Whereas in Cuba and also very much in Venezuela, libertarians are made, and other dissidents also, are made to stare down the barrel of the gun, while some military asshole or some police asshole or some civilian paramilitary asshole talks about, you know, all the different ways that they're going to die because you know, they're right-wing fascists. So the more that they stepped up their level of oppression, they said, you know what, we have to step up our level of activism. So next thing you know, these small L libertarians, this Mises Cuba book club in Havana, they formed the Cuban Libertarian Party. The Cuban Libertarian Party was founded in May of 2017. And then next thing you know, another round of repressions. And a lot of people have told me in hindsight, a lot of people coming out of the woodworks today have told me, you know, Zach, 3 years ago when they started the Cuban LP, I'm going to tell you, brother, we really thought that they were going to get annihilated. Like, we really thought that all of them were going to get arrested and made to disappear in the middle of the night. And that was going to be the end of the libertarian movement in Cuba. And I said, well, they sure as hell tried. I'm not going to lie. They sure as hell tried to annihilate the Cuban LP. There have been multiple times where members of the Cuban LP have been kidnapped by the police, as in usually the police can arrest you if A, they have a warrant, or B, they witness you committing some crime in which they intervene on the spot. In this case, though, the police will have followed somebody or scoped them out for a couple of hours and figured out when they're vulnerable. Then they just grab them. They'll grab them, drag them into a police car. Sometimes it's an unmarked car because every once in a while they do things that are off the books. They'll beat the shit out of the person while he's in the back of the car. Then they'll interrogate them, ask them, you know, what have you been doing? Who have you been seeing? Then they hit them some more. Then they'll drop them in the outskirts of town. So we're talking about a 15, 20-mile walk. You know, we're talking 30 kilometers here. We're talking an entire night full of walking, you know, 12 to 14 hours from where they dropped you off after beating the hell out of you. And then they tell you, often when they would drop these guys off, they would steal their shoes. First, they would let these guys have their shoes. But for example, one of the co-founders, both of the Mises Mambi Institute and of the Cuban Libertarian Party, his name is Nelson Rodriguez Chartrand. Nelson had been kidnapped, beaten, and dropped on the outskirts of town at least 3 times that I counted in my involvement, and a lot of us on the international team, because there was myself, there was a couple of other American volunteers, then there was my assistant, Mamela Fiallo, who is Ecuadorian, and she lives down in Ecuador. She used to live in Buenos Aires. We also have Angie Chamorro from LP Spain. All of us are on the team of international volunteers, and we would be getting phone calls from Cuba in real time while people are saying, hey, the police picked up Alberto. Hey, the police picked up Herbert. Hey, the police picked up Caridad. Or they'll say, hey, Leonette got arrested on false charges. It was absolutely insane. So the Cuban regime absolutely tried to stomp that movement out of existence, but these libertarian activists were merciless. They were tireless. The president of the Cuban LP is a lady whose name is Caridad, which translates to charity, and that's a very appropriate name because this gal, in addition to her libertarian activism, she's also involved in different little informal social groups and NGOs. She's a longtime member of the Ladies in White, which is a special dissident society of former political prisoners or the wives and or mothers of former political prisoners. And Caridad has been both. The Ladies of White get the crap beat out of them by the cops all the time, even though they're specifically a Pacific organization. But she also will do things like mobilizing all the libertarians to go get a little bit of money and then get some ingredients together, and then they'll make little cakes and they'll take them down to the orphanage, and they'll just have a cake and ice cream day with the orphans. Every once in a while, we'll send them a grant so that they can do charity activities. Every once in a while, we'll send the Cuban libertarians a grant. We'll send them $20, $30, and that enables them to have this big ass barbecue in the backyard where they have all the Libertarian Party members, and then anybody else in the neighborhood who's curious and who's ballsy enough to be photographed by state security going to this event where they can learn about new ideas. They do that. And Nelson, the co-founder, this guy went full James Bond. One thing that a lot of people don't know is freedom of movement inside of Cuba and also inside of Venezuela. It's taken very much for granted. You've got to have government permission to go outside of your own province. So Havana, yes, it's a city, but it's also its own province, like a federal district, and then there's a number of other provinces around the country. Nelson, repeatedly, without permission, would just buy himself a bus ticket and take a bus to another province, and he'd go meet up with an old activist buddy, or sometimes he'd really take a chance and he would meet up with another activist that he met on a group on Facebook. And that's one of the reasons why it took so long for cell phones and the internet to get to Cuba, because the regime knew once they give people some kind of internet access, even though they can block a crap load of pages, even though they can censor the internet as much as they can possibly hope, people are still going to find ways to connect. And that's exactly what happened. So Nelson connected with people from other provinces through Facebook. He connected with people from other provinces through personal contacts, and he illegally left Havana province to go grow the libertarian movement. Sometimes it would be founding new chapters of the Cuban LP, and other times he would just be doing the basic libertarian philosophy course through the Mises Mambi Institute. And then other times he would just be visiting with friends, preaching the gospel of anarcho-capitalism. Nelson is an anarcho-capitalist, while other people in the Cuban LP are minarchists. And when I noticed that, that was another beautiful moment for me, because we went from just a couple of people in a house in Havana to all of a sudden we have anarcho-capitalist Cuban libertarians and minarchist Cuban libertarians. We went from a small group of people, who really didn't know what they were talking about, this libertarian stuff, to now there's pro-life and pro-choice libertarians. And that growing movement in Cuba is starting to echo the movement over here in the United States. That is absolutely beautiful, and that is the last thing that this Stalinist regime wanted. So I'm incredibly proud of the Cuban libertarians. Now, I've talked about those guys a lot longer than I planned to, but everything goes back to Cuba. That's how I got involved with them. And the more that we learned about politics in Cuba, and the more that we learned about the Castro government, the more that we learned what the Castro government was doing in the rest of the world. Oftentimes, American libertarians tend to get tunnel vision for the CIA and the U.S. government. Ron Paul Institute, not Dr. Paul himself, but Ron Paul Institute is absolutely guilty of getting CIA and US government tunnel vision. The more that I worked with the Cuban libertarians, I realized, that there are some really garbage governments out there in the world besides the US government, absolutely tyrannical governments, if not in more ways than the US government, then in different ways than the US government. And that is one thing that helped take off my blinders as an American libertarian, because instead of having CIA or US government Tourette syndrome or fixation on that, I learned that we are living in a Game of Thrones world where there are multiple corrupt, bloodthirsty kingdoms all trying to conquer each other and all trying to take advantage of their weaker neighbors. That is absolutely the case with the US government, with the Russian government. It's definitely the case with the Chinese government right now. And it is absolutely the case with the Cuban government. Everybody puts a lot of attention recently on the way the Chinese Communist Party has slowly been spreading its influence across the Pacific Rim, across the rest of the world, across the developing world. But a lot of people often overlook this little empire that the Cuban regime has been building for itself. And people tend to, kind of just look right past it. Nobody would expect a little island country, especially a poor island country like Cuba, to be this imperial power. But then again, look at the history of the British Empire. The British Isles are these small ass islands in the North Atlantic off the coast of Europe that during a couple of hundred years they pretty much controlled a quarter of the world, even though Britain itself, as islands are very poor in natural resources. I'm actually kind of surprised that those people ever got the hell off of those islands to go conquer out, an entire empire like they did. But if that island nation a couple of hundred years ago was able to do that, then why would the Cuban island nation or that regime not be able to do the same thing in the 20th and 21st centuries when we have all this technology? What are some examples of Cuba trying to grow its empire and even do military interventions? Well, I told you guys earlier that Cuba has invaded Venezuela. Very literally, what the United States government is to Afghanistan, Cuba is to Venezuela. There are thousands of Cuban soldiers in Venezuela right now. And most people don't know it because the Cuban regime learned from America's PR disasters in Iraq, in Afghanistan. They learned from America's PR disasters in Abu Ghraib, from the incidents involving the Blackwater troops killing civilians. They learned from all of that. They saw so many photographs in all these different newspapers and magazines, Time magazine, other magazines, of this U.S. soldier with an obviously American combat uniform, holding a rifle while some Iraqi girl gets searched, or while some Afghan farmer's cart gets searched. There's just no way to be in that photograph and not look bad and not look like an invader. So they don't wear Cuban uniforms in Venezuela. Every Cuban soldier in Venezuela wears the uniform of the Venezuelan armed forces or the Venezuelan police, or in the cases where Cuban advisors have been attached to the paramilitary forces, they just wear civilian clothes. There are thousands of Cubans inside of Venezuela, which is why the Maduro regime has lasted so much. So this is where we get to the main topic that was alluded to in the title: libertarians in the Venezuela crisis. As I said a moment ago, the more we learned about what's happening in Cuba, the more we learned about what the Cuban government is doing abroad. And so we, the American libertarians, and also the international team that was helping out the Cuban libertarians, we contacted the libertarian movement of Venezuela, and we decided to offer our assistance to those guys because, number one, we saw that they needed it. Number two, we were interested in continuing to help out libertarians in communist countries. And number three, this was a beautiful way to kind of stick it to the nose of the Castro regime. So we're helping out the libertarians in this country that the regime has colonized on behalf of the Cuban libertarians. We started out on behalf of the Cuban libertarians, and the Venezuelans were incredibly happy to receive our help. The first groups that we started working with were Libertarian Movement of Venezuela, and a lot of that was consulting and fundraising. Consulting as in how to have an effective political movement, especially when you've got this small group of people not a whole lot of money, and then all the established political movements and political parties, they've got people who take it for granted that they're going to vote for these big parties, and these big parties have all kinds of money. Well, the problems that they go through are not very different from the problems that we American libertarians go through. So that was a lot of the. Oh, excuse me.
Whoa.
I done knocked the crap out of the tripod here, but there we go. Restored it. Hopefully everybody can see me. Sorry about that. Believe me, nobody has a bigger heart attack than me. So at first it was consulting, then we moved a lot to helping them fundraise. For example, some of the folks in the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus helped us out with a virtual fundraiser. The Venezuelans needed to raise a few $100s to be able to do a national recruiting tour. So Mises Caucus raised something like $800, and that kept about a dozen people in a van on the road for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And they were able to go across Venezuela. Now, that would never happen in the United States because gas prices and food prices. But down there, where the U.S. dollar goes a long way, $800 got them 3 weeks on the road. And yes, they did absolutely recruit new people into the libertarian movement, into the Vente Venezuela political party, because the libertarian movement is not a political party. It's just the official libertarian club of Venezuela, whereas the libertarian-ish political party is called Vente, which means come Venezuela, and they wear blue shirts. And they also recruited some people into Mises Institute Venezuela, and they increased the size of their audience. Mises Institute Venezuela, very important people. They get a lot of the information about our philosophy and the economics out there. And every time that the Venezuelan government would do something stupid, like increase inflation of the bolivar by another 1,000% or so, or 10,000%, in order to be able to pay off the Maduro regime's debts to Cuba, or debts to China, or debts to Russia, then Mises Institute Venezuela was on the scene, and they were making videos about that, and they're educating people. And us in the Mises Mambi Institute, every once in a while, we've subtitled those videos so that our English-speaking audiences can appreciate what's going on there. So it's been really cool to get feedback on some of these Mises Venezuela video clips from libertarians in Scotland, libertarians in Australia, libertarians in Canada. All of a sudden, the reach is growing much larger, and these folks in Venezuela are on a lot more people's radar. That's not only good for libertarian solidarity, but it is also good for these people's safety, because the more international attention there are on these individuals, the harder it is for the regime to make them disappear. Because make no mistake, there is absolutely a war on libertarians in Venezuela, just like in Cuba, except in Venezuela, it is even more brutal. It is even more severe. Perhaps the most severe case that I can think of right off the top of my head happened to a Venezuelan libertarian by the name of Laurent Soleil. He had to flee from Venezuela because the regime accused him with false charges of terrorism. What it was, he was a student leader. He led some marches against the regime on campus. And apparently in Orwellian Venezuela, if you lead some peaceful marches to criticize the regime, then that is quite literally the equivalent of terrorism. So they started mobilizing the counter-terror police to look for this guy. So he got his ass out of Venezuela and he fled to Colombia. But there was a different administration that was governing Colombia at the time. And one of these things that the Cuban regime and the Venezuelan regime, and also to a certain extent the Chinese regime, like to do is they'll use international means to continue persecuting these people when they're outside of the country. So they were formally requesting that Colombia extradite Laurent Soleil, which they did, except they didn't extradite him formally. They never had any kind of arrest warrant. They didn't charge him with any kind of crimes or anything like that. Just because the Maduro regime was making a number of threats about military action on Colombia's border, and the last Colombian president felt like negotiating with them, the Colombian National Police arrested Laurent Soleil from his safe haven in Colombia, and they handed him over at the border to the Maduro regime. So this libertarian spent the next 4 years in an underground dungeon at the intelligence service headquarters. The acronym for the intelligence service in Venezuela, the Bolivarian Intelligence Service, is SEBIN, SEBIN, but it literally means the Bolivarian Intelligence Service Again, if the CIA and the NSA were one crappy organization rolled into one, that's where he was, and they have this underground prison at their national headquarters where they keep a lot of prisoners. And there's a number of Cubans down there also who are teaching the Venezuelans how to do interrogations, which is a euphemism for torture. I originally, when I heard about what was going on with Lawrence, I thought that his experience would be similar to the Cuban libertarians with this very rustic looking rock wall prisons, Count of Monte Cristo looking type dungeons like they have in Cuba. And Lawrence said, no, absolutely not. It was the opposite. It was like a hospital. It looked more like the Hunger Games. It looked like a clinic. And when they wanted to do something to you, they would, wheel you into a particular room, sometimes march you, sometimes drag you. And if they wanted you to talk, or if they wanted to hurt you, then they would find some kind of acidic chemical compound and they would inject it into your arm. And then next thing you know, your whole body's on fire for 20 minutes because you've got this burning agent that's doing nerve damage to you. Other times they would hit him with truth serum, which makes you a lot more loosened up and it makes it a lot more difficult not to reveal information. Other times they would put plastic bags over his head and then bring him near the point of suffocation where he's about to pass out. And then they would bring him back to and then like hit him on the head, box his ears. The number of tortures, the amount of tortures, and the variety that this libertarian endured are absolutely horrendous. And this happened not just to him, but to so many other people. As a matter of fact, not long before Lawrence himself was freed from this jail, they actually murdered an opposition city councilman out of that same building. And they wrote it off as suicide. Now, this is a maximum security facility because, number one, it's like the National Intelligence headquarters. So not only is it have security as an intelligence headquarters, but there's a prison underneath. And then this guy fell from the fourth floor window, even though he was locked up in an underground prison. And the regime said to the public that it was suicide. So just think about that. In a maximum security facility, this guy escaped from the basement and then decided to climb up to the fourth floor and then jump out a window. I guess, to fight the power. So that's just some of the nonsense where, in a very Stalin-esque way, they'll just kill you and, blatantly lie to you about what happened. And that's the point. That's the whole message right there. Without revealing that card to the rest of the world, even though it's super transparent, without revealing their hand to the rest of the world, they're telling their own people, this is what we will do to you if you question authority. This is what we will do to you if you continue to lead marches and student groups against the Bolivarian Revolution. There's another libertarian that I want to tell you guys about. Her name is Melanie Manjoud, and her ordeal with the National Guard and with the communist paramilitaries happened a little bit over a year ago. So everybody remembers when Juan Guaido became the president of Venezuela, which, by the way, let me just make a quick note. There is a misconception that's going around the international press that Juan Guaido declared himself president. That is absolutely a falsehood. That came from the Cuban propaganda machine, and other media outlets picked up that line. He did not declare himself anything. He actually didn't even want to show up for his first day of work as president, but the National Assembly elected him as president. Now, according to Article 233 of Venezuela's constitution, which is Hugo Chavez's constitution, if there is no duly elected president, then the National Assembly will elect from their own body. It's like the House of Representatives, except they only have one House of Parliament instead of two. Then they themselves will elect somebody from the National Assembly to be the provisional president, and then his job basically is running the government and also making elections happen so that they can have a regular president instead of a provisional one. So he was elected under the Constitution as provisional president, and instead of helping to topple this regime or making elections happen, unfortunately, Juan Guaido has only worked on securing his personal fortune and the fortunes of some of his allies. But fact of the matter is, he did not declare himself as a president. He is the legitimate president. Once he was elected president, declared president by the National Assembly, there was this big PR event. I don't know if you guys remember seeing the news last year, but Richard Branson was having that big old fundraiser for that Live Aid concert in Colombia that was right by the border. And then after the Live Aid concert, there was going to be these big old convoys of humanitarian aid that were going to ride from Colombia across the border into Venezuela. And the Venezuelan military was going to choose to throw down their weapons and not cut food and medicine off from their people who are starving and who are suffering from medieval level illnesses. There are literally people who are dying in Venezuela right now of the plague. That is some medieval shit. And that's what happens under socialism. This is what we see, if you want a Misesian reference, Pictures of the Socialistic Future by Eugen Richter, which is a fictional diary of somebody whose country becomes, it becomes a socialist country, and next thing you know, it becomes full-on communist with a destroyed economy and mass poverty. What else? Anthem by Ayn Rand. This is after the revolution, and they're in this like Stone Age society where something as an electric light is treated as heretical. Well, that's the kind of thing that does happen. The final chapters of Atlas Shrugged, where you've got freaking covered wagons replacing the American railroad. That is what happens in these countries where the socialists and the communists take power. And that is literally what happened in Venezuela. So anyway, Guaido's president. Richard Branson has that big old Live Aid concert. They're going to bring humanitarian aid across the border. Surprise, surprise, the regime mobilized the army and the paramilitary on the borders, but also throughout the country to squash the protests, because a lot of people supported Juan Guaido. That doesn't mean that they liked Juan Guaido as a guy. That meant that an overwhelming majority of the Venezuelan people were so sick and tired of that communist dictator Maduro, who had turned their country into a very poor satellite of Cuba, whose economy and whose oil had been ransacked by Cuba. I mean, we talk very openly about what America's motive was for invading Iraq. It was very obviously controlling shares of those oil markets. Well, guess what Venezuela's biggest freaking export is? I guarantee you the reason why there are thousands of Cuban troops and thousands of Cuban doctors that don't have any medical training whatsoever inside of that country is because of the oil. So anyway, this young lady, Melanie Manjud, she has a little foundation that she runs in Venezuela where she'll raise funds from outside the country, and then she'll occasionally do these weekend trips to the Colombian border. She'll cross into Colombia and get like a big fat pallet of different kinds of medication, and she'll bring them to these underserved hospitals, and she brings them to the pediatric ward. So kids with cancer, kids who need insulin injections on a regular basis, but they don't have them, so they got hospitalized. Kids with terminal illnesses, kids with non-terminal illnesses that are lethal if they're not treated, and so a lot of these kids are dying because they have untreated illnesses. This young lady, Melanie, she helps them. She goes and gets medicines for them. So it was February. It was that same weekend as when they sent the paramilitaries to go block and burn the humanitarian aid convoys at the border. Melanie had brought a shipment of humanitarian aid to one of the local hospitals. And inside of the hospital, while she was handing out medicine to kids, the freaking National Guard showed up along with civilian paramilitaries. Now, can you imagine? Because a lot of people have seen the National Guard in their in their neighborhood. People survived the Los Angeles riots. People survived Hurricane Katrina. A few people went to those National Guard field hospitals for the COVID. So people have seen the National Guard mobilize. But can you just imagine if you were not doing anything that was technically illegal, and then the National Guard just busted into the room along with civilian vigilantes? Like, there's just some Joe Schmo in civilian clothes with a shotgun, standing right next to the soldiers. That's what happened to this young lady. And that's one thing that happens on a regular basis in Venezuela, where members of the regime with actual uniforms and government powers will often be flanked by their civilian auxiliaries, these random civilians who have weapons, and they're the only civilians in the country who have weapons because the regime made it that way. They'll just come and arrest you and drag you out. A lot of times, armed civilians will drag you to the police station instead of actual police officers. This is what happened to Melanie. She got dragged out of the room to another end of the hospital, where first it was a National Guard officer that was interrogating her. Then the civilian paramilitaries slapped her around a little bit, and they were threatening her, yo, bitch, we're going to fucking kill you if you keep doing this, blah, blah. You're a traitor. You shouldn't be trying to undermine this regime. This is a revolution of the people. People like you deserve to die. You're evil for what you do. Now, mind you, they are actively stopping her from bringing medication to a pediatric ward in a hospital, but she is evil because she's going against their communist revolution. So this is the level of psychosis that's going on there. And she ended up getting arrested for like the day. She was detained for the day. And the reason that she was arrested is because the director of that hospital, who was put there by the regime as a political appointment, the director of that hospital, that Marxist, reported her to the National Guard. She called the police, and the police deployed the National Guard. Military response for the high crime of giving freaking medicine to sick children in the hospital. This is the level of control, because they should have gone through the regime. The regime doesn't freaking have medicine to give to their own people, let alone to ordinary people who have no value to the regime. So she got arrested. She got slapped around. She got threatened with death. And the communist who runs that hospital, who reported her to the regime, that same person ended up becoming a victim of her own success. That hospital director at a later date got sick, and she died because there were not enough medicines in the area to treat her. So, like, literally, this is a death cult. It is absolutely a death cult. This is what libertarians in Cuba and Venezuela are fighting against. Let me tell you guys about Jesus Noria, who is a member of the libertarian movement of Venezuela. On the 30th of April, when Juan Guaido led that fake military uprising against the regime, and we can get into that at another time, but it wasn't a real effort. It was only to free his ally, Leopoldo Lopez. But the fact of the matter is, the entire country went out into the streets to support this guy because they thought they were finally going to get rid of the regime. Well, Jesus, who is a member of the libertarian movement, was wearing his libertarian T-shirt. He was wearing his T-shirt with the big old porcupine on it when he jumped on top of a car, and he said, "Come on, people, let's march right up to the cops and let's tell them to throw down their guns because this is happening. We're getting rid of this regime." Well, the paramilitaries saw him. The civilian paramilitaries saw him. They grabbed him. They dragged him over to the National Guard, where he was detained, and he got the shit beat out of him. He physically, literally got beaten. I saw the photographs of when they finally released him immediately after. He had a big old black eye around his right eye, and he lost 50% of the vision in his right eye. Let me tell you guys about another libertarian. His name is Franklin Camargo. He was a medical student at Romulo Gallegos University. He was training to be a doctor. And after Juan Guaido was sworn in as president by the National Assembly, all the students in the school were called into a big lecture hall where they got subjected to a communist indoctrination session about how everybody at this school owes the Bolivarian Revolution because they're getting free college. Look what the revolution is doing for you. You owe it to the revolution to support the president and not to support these fascists, blah, blah, blah. This is a socialist country. And Franklin literally just raised his hand and he said, "Sir, I disagree with this." And the guy said, "What? What do you mean? What do you mean you disagree with this?" And he says, "Yeah, I disagree with socialism. I disagree with the Bolivarian Revolution. I disagree with what you're preaching. I believe in free markets. I believe in free expression. And I think it's really inappropriate that that class time got interrupted for a political lecture." And that guy said, "Get out of here right now. Go to the dean's office right now." So he marches on down to the dean's office where that guy was waiting for him. Long story short, he got expelled. He got expelled for acts of aggression against the teacher. Literally, disagreeing. That's all he did. He raised his hand and very politely disagreed. And that was an act of aggression. And the words act of aggression quickly got spun into physical attack because during the days after his expulsion, Franklin started doing speeches, not only on his old campus, but also in other public places. And these speeches got the attention of the regime to the point where Diosdado Cabello, who is the number 2 guy in the regime, heard about this. And the guy has a weekly talk show. It's actually kind of funny if it wasn't so horrible. The Venezuelan regime has had this weekly talk show since Hugo Chavez started doing it almost 20 years ago. where they just talk about, whatever's going on that week. And it's supposed to be like the political version of Jimmy Fallon, except with, yay communism. And so Diosdado's on TV talking about, all right, so we've got this little fascist who's committing acts of aggression over here at this medical school. Sounds like a little punk. Well, if he's going to be committing acts of aggression and doing terrorism, then, we can show him. So all you guys in the intelligence service that are over there in the state of Aragua, come on, what are you guys waiting for? What are you guys waiting for? Well, can you just imagine if the director of the FBI was on live TV talking to the FBI in that area about you? That's what happened to Franklin. So lo and behold, they started going after him, and he had to get the hell out of Venezuela. And he didn't really have a way to do that because he was just a young college kid. His resources were so stretched thin. So the person who took charge of getting Franklin out of Venezuela was none other than Dr. Kyle Varner, who is an American medical doctor and also a member of the Libertarian Party over here. Dr. Kyle Varner was personally involved in getting Franklin out of that country. And within 1 week of Franklin being inside the United States, he was attending his first meeting of the Libertarian Party of Miami-Dade. And nowadays, his asylum is approved. He lives in the state of Utah with his brother, and he is currently working as a medical interpreter. And once he gets all of his papers straightened out, he wants to go back to medical school because he knows that he was destined to be a doctor. And unfortunately, communism ruined his life. There's one last thing that I want to talk about. A lot of people have asked me why I am involved in Venezuela. Well, as I said earlier, originally I was involved with Cuba. And the more we learned about the Castro regime's war on libertarians in Cuba, the more we learned about the Castro regime's literal war in Venezuela, which unfortunately has evolved into a civil war because now we've got the regime is not only killing dissidents, but you also have Colombian guerrillas that are inside the country fighting with Colombian paramilitaries. So the Colombian civil war spilled over into Venezuela, but Maduro invited the communist guerrillas into the country because they'll fight for him, and they do fight for him. And they're also part of his drug cartel. But now you have criminal drug cartels and criminal gangs inside the country who, other than the regime's people, the criminals are the only other ones that have guns. The criminals used to kind of work for the regime in the sense that the regime's like, all right, if you only rob and loot and murder the correct people, not our people, then you're good to go. Well, these people used to stick to that formula, but now they're openly fighting the regime. There's an ongoing war with the regime against this gangster in a particular city who's named Alexis, that he's got his own personality cult. The situation is so bad that people around the country are praying for this Al Capone-style gangster because he is less bad than the Stalinist regime that's over them. And people ask me, why am I involved? Because people ask me for help. First, the Cubans asked me for help, and then we offered our help to the Venezuelans. But the Venezuelans, they needed it. They were happy for it. And it got to the point where originally we were just giving them advice on libertarian activism. 3 years later, Kyle Varner has treated Venezuelan refugees at the Colombian border. He went down to the Colombian border and actually got involved. Recently, there was a failed military operation that happened with that involved some American mercenaries and some Venezuelan exiles. Well, over a year ago, I personally recruited several companies of American military contractors. That was my former career. I worked as a private contractor before I became a libertarian anarchist, but because I still had those contacts from my old life, and I'll wrap this up, I still had those contacts from my old life. I recruited people who were willing to pitch Juan Guaido's government on a contract like, all right, we will train your people, we can train the army. If you guys want, we'll also bring more columns of humanitarian aid into Venezuela. We can set up field hospitals to help out the civilians because they need food, they need medicine. And what we could help you guys do is establish, little islands of freedom inside the country while the army that we train fights. So we were not talking anything about a Bay of Pigs style CIA intervention. Our effort had nothing to do with the CIA. We were actually trying to help the Venezuelans liberate Venezuela. Unfortunately, Juan Guaido's government turned down our offers And we were wondering why back then, but we know today Juan Guaido's government doesn't want to overthrow the regime. Why? Because Juan Guaido is not right wing. He is a socialist. Almost all of the political parties in Venezuela are socialist and members of the Socialist International. That's not right wing, except Juan Guaido is not a Stalinist. So that's what Venezuela is. It's mostly the socialists versus the Stalinists, and the socialists are corrupt, and a lot of them have businesses that they started with these different communists 20 years ago, so they don't want the regime to end. They are actually very happy with the status quo while so many libertarians die, while the Venezuelan libertarians are saying, you know what, if our country is ever going to be free, and if our country is ever going to be not a nightmare, then we have to start over from the beginning with free markets, the right to bear arms, and an absolutely limited government, and we cannot do this alone. We need help. So I stay involved in the struggle for Venezuela's freedom as an individual. America should not have to fight Venezuela's war. But if there are Americans who are either vets who want to go down there and fight, or if there are American libertarians who want to help the Venezuelan libertarians continue to do their thing, then absolutely, as individuals, we should answer the call for help because they are asking for it. And that is not for an intervention, which is something that we libertarians are against. That is free association by voluntary individuals, voluntary association by individuals. Now, if anybody wants more information on Cuban and Venezuelan libertarians, the website is www.cubanlibertarians.org. That's cubanlibertarians.org.
Awesome, Zach. Thank you so much. We went way over our time today, but you were very insightful. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining Taxation is Thus Fest 2020. And
the pleasure. My voice is hoarse.
Yeah. So and we'll give a big shout out to Dr. Kyle Varner. He's a good friend of mine. So
good
anyway,
deal.
All right. Take care. Thanks for being on, and we'll see you next time.
May the force be with you.
And also with you.
Well, I'm live. No break, no rest for the weary. I am Brandon Kirby, aka the Drunken Libertarian. Happy as all get out to be here for the Taxation is Theft Fest 2020. And I have with me here today a special guest, Nick Reed. Nick, how are you doing today?
Great. Thank you for having me on.
It's all my pleasure. Now, just by way of a biographical note here, Nick Reed is an author, speaker, entrepreneur, and activist. Presently, he works at the Grassroots Leadership Academy, designing programs that empower activists, organizers, and social change entrepreneurs to advance liberty through long-term culture and policy change. Now, that sounds fascinating. Nick, you're here to talk to us about winning people over arguments in the age of contempt. That sounds fascinating. That sounds like one of the more interesting talks that we could have on the menu for today. The next 45 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brandon. So the issue that I want to talk about, I believe to be one of the biggest issues of our generation, and that is the growing political divide. We are more divided politically today than maybe even we were racially in the 40s and 50s, and certainly economically and geographically. People don't want their kids to grow up and marry somebody who voted for the other guy. Legislators will refuse to sign on to legislation if it's introduced by somebody of an opposing party, even if they agree with it and think it's good legislation. And legislators will sign on to bad bills just because it was introduced by somebody of their party. People will unfriend people on Facebook and surround themselves with a confirmation bias of people who believe and think and walk and talk just like them, as well as their news and their information at the same time. But the problem is not just that people disagree. The problem is not that people think the other person is incorrect or wrong. The problem, the unique thing about today is we actually think that people we disagree with are bad people. We think that people we disagree with are evil. or stupid. And this is a very unique thing to our time period. So what the heck is going on? And what can we do about it? Especially, how can we promote the causes and the principles that we care about and advance them, at the same time not contributing to this growing political polarization and culture of contempt? Well, so that's what I want to talk about. So to get into it, I want to share with you an insight I had in an odd situation. It was 2014, and I was volunteering for the National Domestic Violence Hotline, helping victims of abuse with getting out of their situation and healthy relationship, education. I got a call from a mother who was calling about her daughter who was in an abusive situation. And the mother was asking me this question. She said, how is it that somebody can say some of the things that they say to another person? How is it that somebody can do some of the things that this guy's doing to another person? And it was at that moment that, for the first time, I asked the question, are they actually seeing another person? And it hit me, maybe I think we might actually be seeing something else, something more along the lines of an object or a possession. The word abuse comes from Latin, abuti, and it means away and use. It's a misuse. And a misuse is, of course, characterized by what our nature is, right? Well, the nature of an object is very different than the nature of a person. An object has no intrinsic value apart from its use to you, but people do. An object is not self-interested, self-driving, self-directing, self-learning. An object is moved by external forces, but people are. And if you were to treat or to see a person as an object and respond in kind, that's where you could get some serious problems, especially regarding people's rights and the nature of our relationship and our culture and all the things that follow. When we look, for example, at capital cases, we see something very interesting too. When you look at a capital case, when people are on trial for murder, say in Texas, where we have that, the prosecuting attorney is invariably trying to convince the jury that the accused is a monster. And the defending attorney is always trying to convince the jury that the accused is a human being. Why? The answer is simple. It's because it's hard to kill a human being, but it's easy to kill a monster. You see?
Right.
So, yes. So the what's going on here is at the root of, and we would think, oh, well, that's about murder. Oh, that's about, very gross forms of violence. But what we're doing is the same thing at kind of the pseudo-intellectual level. It's an intellectual game of domination that we're playing. Let me give you a case in point. So when the human being is born, we are born into a state of symbiosis. This is a little bit of developmental psychology and how this ties into the issue of the objectification and dehumanization that happens, right? When a human being is born, we're born in total dependency on a mother. Mother is food, mother is warmth, mother is water, mother is protection, mother is everything. And then what happens? Slowly we start to learn to crawl, then we learn to talk, then we learn to walk, then we internalize our own mom and dad, and we gain our independence. We become more and more free. But freedom brings with it, the independence also brings you're alone and isolation. And all of the data is out in psychoanalytic literature that if we do not learn to bridge this divide and relate to our world and others in a productive way, say in a loving or a charitable, or at least a respectful, tolerant way, then we can experience a separation anxiety. We can experience ourselves as alienated from the other. And this can lead to a couple different problems, but usually we're escaping this separation anxiety in a few ways. One of which is you try and get rid of the other, right? And this can happen very like in a grotesque form, like slavery, right? You're confronted with another that you don't identify with, and you impose your will on them, and you make them an extension of your will. Well, guess what happens? Psychologically, the experience is you get rid of them. So there's no them. Now there's just you. Now there's no other. There's no conflict, no separation anxiety. Great. Well, except for you never really get rid of the other, right? And so there's also this inverse form of this where you have the situation where I can get rid of me through conformity, through submission. I can just become an extension of somebody else's will or wishes, and then there's no me, or adopt their ideology or belief system or something like that. I lose myself in the party, in the group, in the crowd, whatever, the tribe. And then there's no experience of conflict anymore, right? Except for you never really get rid of yourself. Well, this doesn't just happen in domestic violence. It doesn't just happen when you're talking about capital cases. This happens also at the pseudo-intellectual level that Americans are operating right now. So when we are engaging in these political debates with others that we disagree with about the issues that we care about, we have this crusade mentality, this idea that we need to convert them or get them to come over to our side or something like that. And it's the same thing happening, just at a more subtle level, but nevertheless has the same results. So we're talking about the issue here of objectification and alienation from each other. And we're talking about the polarization that's happening in our culture, that's dividing our dinner tables, not just our country. What can we do about it?
Right.
Well, let's talk about that. So the first thing I want to introduce is this idea of deep civility, right? We've all heard the term civil dialogue, right? Well, first of all, let me tell you what I'm not talking about when I say the word civility. I'm not talking about foregoing having difficult conversations or shying away from them so that we can replace it with some kind of token niceties, right? That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm not talking about is avoiding having these confrontations that ultimately could lead to something productive, or going through the messiness of being able to talk to other people who think differently so that you can avoid having that kind of tension. That's not what I'm talking about. What I am talking about is underneath the conversation, there being this deep-rooted, deep-seated sense of unconditional positive regard for another person. That's what I'm talking about. Let me ask you this. And if you can have this, what this does is ultimately, when you see somebody engaging in an audience, say engaging somebody they disagree with,
right,
and somebody's looking at them and talking to them respectfully as if they're a human being, even though they totally disagree, all of those people who are watching are also listening. And there's something to be said about what someone does, not just what someone says. And our behavior toward another person can act in the same way that it's like the tree is known by its fruit, right? They're looking in your eyes and they're saying, is this person in a place that I'm trying to get to? And if they look and they're like, wow, look at all that animosity and hate, I'm not sure that is a place I want to get to, then you can actually lose the person even if you win the argument. But isn't it also true that you can win a person even if you lose an argument? Absolutely, you can. And so the question is, how do we be able to turn the tide here and use to our advantage the fact that most Americans hate the fact that we're so divided and polarized, to actually be a window rather than a wall to the principles that we want to advance? Does that make sense? Yeah. So
go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
My concern is, to what extent is that committing the ad hominem fallacy, where the argument is persuasive because of the particular characteristics of the individual rather than the merits of their argument?
No. Okay. So thank you. Let's drop it down into a personal example. So it's 2010. I just moved to Sweden. I just got injured. Right. I'm crutching on ice. It's a bad Disney show. And I go to this language school so I can learn Swedish. Well, Sweden at the time was bringing in, people from war-torn countries all across the world: Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Palestine. And so they're all coming here to Sweden as refugees, and they're learning the language too. So who do you think I'm going to bump into, right? Well, here I come, and I'm in a vulnerable state, and I hear from across the hall a gentleman yell, and he says, "Hey, you're from America, no?" And he comes on over, and he's a big kind of buff Iraqi looking dude. And he comes up with his 5 friends to me, right? And he says, the first thing out of his mouth is religion and politics. And he goes, what do you think about Obama? What do you think about us Muslims? Isn't it true that on American TV, all they show is us Muslims as terrorists blowing things up and doing bad things? And I start to get into him and argue with him, right? So isn't it true that on Iraqi TV, all they show is US soldiers blowing through walls and doing bad things? Isn't it? And then I'm like, whoa, hold on a second. Stop. I was like, all right, I want you to walk away, and I want you to come back. And we're going to start over. And this time, I want you to talk to me like I'm your brother. Okay? Don't put me on this side or that side of the fence. I want you to walk up and just try and talk to me like your brother and see what happens. Because you don't know it yet, but we are brothers. And he crosses his arms and he looks over at me and he says, he looks back at his friends and he looks back at me and he says, my friend, but that is how I want to talk to everyone. And I've been trying to have these difficult conversations and no one would talk with me. And before you know it, he invited me back to his house and we're sitting on his floor in his modest apartment, eating their traditional food with our hands and sharing about our culture. And do you know what I found out? I found out that this gentleman, his family had been killed. They had been a casualty of the war. They were civilians who were blown up by US soldiers, and he fled the country out of his war-torn city to come here. And he had never met an American. The only thing he knew about American was what he had heard on the news or seen in Hollywood. And I was the first American he had ever come in contact with. And we became great friends. But I got that opportunity because I was able to change the game that we play. And as a result, I won the person and I didn't even engage in the argument. And so the question is, are we committing an ad hominem or are we trying to be persuasive? I wouldn't even look at it as persuasive. So persuasion for me is still too far in the game of who's right. And in the game of who's right, there's someone who's right and there's someone who's wrong. There's a winner and there's a loser. But when you think about the relationships where you have the most openness to somebody being able to hear what it is that you want to share, are they a competitive relationship? What about your marriage? Is marriage something you can win or lose? Who's the winner in marriage? And there's no being first in friendship, right? This is something Simon Sinek talks about in his infinite game concept. It's the same. And when we think about things as a competition, we don't approach our friendships and relationships as a debate. If we did, what would be the consequence? It would devolve very quickly and it would become hostile and you wouldn't have the trust necessary to have that kind of close relationship and trust that enables people to be open to what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I follow you.
Total proof of this. I'm married to a woman from a socialist country of Sweden. When we met, what do you think was her political ideology? Yeah.
Not a good one.
It was extremely socialistic.
Oh, dear.
People ask, what's that like? And I say, well, she takes half my paycheck, but I get great benefits. So but seriously, though, and moving on from deep civility, the next idea I want to introduce to you is this. And I want to start by telling a story. At that time also, I was masquerading around as a substitute teacher. And I'd go into schools and I would test new social experiments and workshops on these unsuspecting classes in international high schools. And it afforded me a unique opportunity. And one day I did this workshop called We're Going to Change the World. And so I told everybody in this classroom in an international high school in Sweden, today I want you to get into groups and I want you to do 3 things. I want you to identify, 1, what's the biggest change that you want to see in this world right now? 2, what is the best plan you can think of to make it happen? And 3, I want you to do it in English and come on up and present. And so, boom, they got to work and they were going at it. They loved it. And then after about 5 minutes, they were all done. And I said, well, come on up. And so the first one would walk up to the front and he would say, well, we think that poverty is a big issue. And what we think that the prime minister should do is da-da-da-da-da. Thank you. Sit down. The next person would come up and they would say, well, we think that crime is a big issue, and you know what the city should do is da 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 da. The Pope should do this. The school should do that. The council should do this. Not one person had a single thing that they could actually walk out the door and do. And I realized something. This is very disempowering, right? We have this sort of bias for top-down thinking and problem solving. It's a giant cognitive blind spot in our culture today. And as a result, when you listen to a lot of the disagreements between people about a certain issue, it's never about what I'm going to do. If we're talking about the issue of homelessness, no one is criticizing or arguing with me about going out and helping homeless people. No, it's always about what we're complaining the mayor should do or the governor or the president. The issue is with how are we going to spend our tax dollars, or the issue is with a solution that's going to force me to do it too. It's got to be something I agree with. It's always an issue of top down. Once you can take it down, drop it down into the personal level, a few things happen. One, it's way easier for people to be able to connect to what you're saying. And two, it's very hard to argue with somebody who's going out and doing good in the world. Okay. The first one is very difficult to argue with that. Check this out. So when we're talking about top down versus bottom up, there is a discrepancy that people have between their personal beliefs and their political ideologies. Case in point. So if I support, let's say, healthcare for all, right? Or I support public libraries, right? I think these are good ideas. That's my political ideology. Now, let's say that I'm in the lunch line, or I see my kid in the lunch line, and Johnny comes up to him and says, "Hey, punk, give me your lunch money. I'm going to beat you up." Johnny says, "No, it's my lunch money. I'll give it to you if I want to. You can't take it." And he says, "But it's for a library." Would you say, "Sure, that kid can take my kid's money or beat him up. That's perfectly okay"? Absolutely not. No one would let that. And so the way that we know how to treat one another and interact with one another on a personal level is way more aligned than it is when we get up into the supranational macroeconomic systems that we're talking about that involve so many moving parts and so much complexity that people can hardly be able to align everything. And so the issue is that we support policies and issues that we would not personally be willing to go out and enforce. And it's so far disconnected from us.
That's so true.
That we're alienated from it. We don't understand how laws are implemented and the force that goes behind them when they're making top-down change. And if we were put on the front lines with guns to have to go and rob grandmas to build libraries, I think it would be a different story after a couple robberies, right?
Yeah.
So that's a major thing that people can do, is move to bottom-up conversations rather than top-down. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of bottom-up solutions that you can actually talk about. One, does anybody know what the pink ribbon is? Yes, you do.
Yeah.
It's breast cancer awareness. What is that? Does anybody know what the ice bucket challenge is? Yes, you do. It's raising awareness about ALS. You can do the same thing, and it doesn't have to be a full-on public awareness campaign, but raising awareness is something that many people can do that advances your causes. And in fact, many of these issues and causes are a problem because they're existing in the dark. So bringing them into the light can create all kinds of new solutions and possibilities that you never thought of. Two, build a business. Everything in this room, everything in your pocket, and everything that you are using to look at this video right now was once the idea of somebody who thought up a way to improve people's lives through a product or service. How could you create a product or service that could advance the cause or the purpose that you believe in? Three, build stronger and healthier communities. The absence of community is the start of tyranny. Government is a substitute for what community used to do and once was. And the less power with other people that you have and the less trust, the more that we rely on the force of the state and top-down solutions to implement changes. And most of the problems that we have, the issues that you care about and want to advance, are exacerbated by the absence or the toxicity of our existing community quality. Okay? 4, you can modify and reform or innovate within the existing institutions, within the institution of business, within the institution of government or education or community. You can go in and make changes to the existing things. And that's what mostly our grassroots organization is involved in, is training citizens how to make a difference beyond just voting and paying your taxes. And people don't know where to start, especially at the grassroots level. And we work specifically in a way that creates more freedom instead of less.
Right. So I just want to make sure I'm hearing you. Taking all this passion that we have for fostering political divide and establishing that which is other, but instead building the people that we're trying to help up. So no longer creating the divide, but just going out into the community and engaging and taking this bottom-up approach and using all that passion that we used to use to destroy, but instead to use it to build. Am I extrapolating from you correctly?
I think you are. Michelangelo said it best when he said, criticize by creating.
Yes.
Who can do
Yes.
that?
There you go.
That should sum it up right there. And when we are engaging in these issues, I don't want people to feel stuck between the false choice of contributing to the polarization and divide and going to all the ad hominems and stuff that creates this issue and doing nothing. That's a false choice. There is a middle way. And these are the things that people can do. And one of them is talk about it from the bottom up, because nobody argues what you're going to walk out the door and do. All right. The next thing that people can do is policy over politics. So when we're talking about issues, especially the things that we disagree with, we usually talk about them from a partisan perspective. Those Democrats, those Republicans, those this, those that. We're not talking about the actual policies. And so when you are faced with somebody who you disagree with, I'm going to bet that there is some common ground if you were to look for it. And that could be on CJR, civil asset forfeiture, extremely cross-partisan. And then take decriminalization. This is a transpartisan issue as well. There's a number of issues that are transpartisan, including cronyism, corporate welfare, that you could be engaging in that could create common ground. And should you not work with somebody who agrees with you on some policy position, even if they're part of the opposing party or are on the other side of every single other issue? So should George Soros and Charles Koch work together if they were to agree on one issue, like free speech or something like that, and advance free speech? Should they not advance free speech just because everyone who's in this camp and that camp, they all hate each other? Well, then we'd end up with nothing. We'd end up with less free speech, ultimately. What a drag. So this is the issue. Our legislators are not going forward on policies with people that are in different parties just for that fact, when in fact, we could be making great changes as a country and at the top down level, if only we could overcome this mental model. So let's move on to the next one. This one is where it's going to get you. If you really want to address the issue that's underlying the deep psychology of horribilizing or dehumanizing others that's affecting our culture, you have to go and talk to the devil. You have to go talk not to the caricature of a devil. You have to go talk to your boogeyman, who you have objectified the most, because the roots of this vine that's creeping up in our dinner tables, it goes all the way down to those you have objectified and horribilized the most. The people we love to hate. Take a Hitler, for example, right? Oh, yeah, we can really get behind that. Or a terrorist. Yeah, we can all come together through a common enemy. But the personalized one for you, that if you can humanize and stand with those who are the most object, or those you have projected the most evil onto, until you are face to face with a human being, then you can do it in every other conversation with people who are just a little bit of you projecting your evil on it. Then you can do it with a Democrat if you're a Republican, or a Republican if you're a Democrat. What's that? I mean, they're subpar compared to my personalized devil. Let me give an example. So when I was doing this myself, well, first of all, like Abdullah confronted me, and I was his boogeyman. When he saw me, he looked at America. I was his devil, and he had the courage to confront me fearlessly and stand face to face with me until all of a sudden we could become friends and see ourselves in the other person. And we learned a whole lot. So I was inspired to go out and do this myself. And I realized that the people that I had demonized the most were law enforcement officers. It was the officer who everything you say and do can and will be used against you, but never for you. The guy who's going on fishing expeditions, trying to trump up charges with anything else he can find. It's not my problem. I'm just doing my job out of my hands. Deal with the courts, police officer. This was the guy, right? So I said, the next time that I come across a cop, I'm going to talk to them. And I'm going to keep talking to them until I'm standing face to face with a human, not a cop, no matter what it takes. And so this particular time that I came across law enforcement, the next time I'm at a gas station, I walk in to buy something and I see two police officers standing by the coffee machines about midnight. It was a little late. And I said, "What are you fellas doing up so late?" "Hey." And they said, "Well, what are you doing up so late?" And I said, "Fair enough. This is going to go great, but I'm committed," right? So I finished checking out. I walk over to these gentlemen and I say, "How are you doing? How are you? What are you doing out here tonight? What's going on? Anything exciting? Your line of work is so far from my line of work that," which in hindsight probably made me sound like a criminal, but I was going off the cuff. And they said, "Oh, we're not doing much." And there was an older guy and a younger guy. And the younger guy, he got nervous. And he said, "Why don't you take 3 steps back? Can you take your hands out of your pockets? You got some ID on you. Is that your car? Is that registered in your name? Let me check you out. You step outside with me." And he starts getting cop mode and he's amping himself up. And I say, hold on. "You look really anxious." He's like, Yeah, I am." I go, "This is really weird for you, isn't it?" He goes, "Oh, yeah." And nobody comes up and says hello to you, do they? And they say, "No, usually they, wave from a distance, say hi, but nobody comes up like this, like close and talks to us. This is pretty weird, actually. Yeah, I'm going to check you out. So I need you to come outside." So they take me outside. They're running my plates to see if I'm a criminal, checking all that out. And I'm standing here with the older gentleman while the younger gentleman does that. And I ask him, "Do you know why I came up to talk to you?" And he says, "Nope, honestly, I have no idea." And I said, "Let me tell you why. When I see red and blue lights, when I hear a siren, when I see a man in uniform, when I see a big badge, I don't see a person. I see a cop. And I know right now that when you look at me, you don't see a person. You see a suspect, a potential troublemaker, a possible criminal. And that's how you're responding. You're checking me out. You're running my plates, trying to figure out what's going on. But we keep closing ourselves in and we're drawing smaller and smaller circles around ourselves that exclude almost everybody till there's nobody left. And I said, and the next time that I come across someone who works in law enforcement, I don't want to see a cop. I want to see a human being, and vice versa. And right now, there's a lot of talk about this war going on between us, the war on cops by civilians and the war on the American people by the militarization of our law enforcement. But I said, I don't think there's a war going on between us and you, between us and them. I think there's a war going on between us and the whole idea of there even being an us against them. And I'm building an army, and I want you on my side. Will you join me? And they did. And so the question I pose to our listeners is, will you join me as well in solving possibly one of the greatest issues and challenges of our generation that's dividing our nation. I'm Nick Reed. Thank you very much.
Nick, fantastic job. Well done. We don't have an audience here to give you a standing applause, but I have to tell you, I was anticipating that would be one of the better talks, and you did not disappoint. So thank you for that. I really did appreciate it. I've got a litany of questions myself, but I think maybe we should go to the audience first.
Absolutely. Please do.
Yes. Zygmunt, whose last name I am not going to get correctly, so I hope you do not view me as that which is the other. I hope you can view me as us.
Reichenbach?
We're just Reichenbach. Yes, I agree with what Nick is saying. What I'm wondering about is how do we get people to have the courage to have a tough conversation with folks you might ordinarily disagree with?
How do we get people to have the courage to have these conversations? Is that what his question was?
Yeah, because you do have to have the tough conversation. We have some major ethical issues going on right now. And so I get what you're saying in terms of have these conversations as humanly as possible, recognizing the human element of the other individual. I think I've heard you correctly on that, and I've heard you loud and clear.
Let me give you an example.
How do you get people to who are so obsessed with saying, oh, well, this is my brother, my aunt, or this is my colleague, and I just want to have a really good really good relationship, and so I might forego having a really important conversation with them?
Let me ask you this, audience and Zygmunt. Who do you trust the most, more than anybody in this world? Who are you closest to? And who do you trust the least? Who could say something to you and you would automatically believe the opposite? For some people, this is the media, right? And the people they trust the most, maybe it's their mom or their spouse. There's a profound difference between these two. And there's also a profound difference between people that we've put on a pedestal out somewhere and people who we consider peers. There's a very successful business school called Acton Academy, or Acton Business School as well, that brings in people's heroes. They have them identify who their hero is, the person for whom they've projected all of the qualities of which they deny in themselves onto somebody else, positive qualities, right? And they bring them in to meet these people. And it's very successful for at least this one reason. It humanizes, because you can dehumanize the other way too. You can turn people into gods. And so once someone who's afraid of having these conversations sees their peers doing it, it brings it down a notch. It's no longer something for just saints and demigods. This is something that everybody can do. Hell, if my peers can do it, I could do it. And so it doesn't start with how do we convince somebody else to have the courage. It starts by how do we show them. Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. So lead by example on that, so that you have very loving, very, I don't know if that's an American word to say, a loving conversation, but anybody who gawks at the word love will never experience freedom. I'm going to tell you that, because when you get to a certain degree of freedom, where you also get to a certain degree of aloneness or isolation or independence, right? And so to get to the next level, right, you can't hold that separation anxiety. You can't hold that current. Right. It's too strong. You have to escape it into control and dependency, back to the old ways of the mother. And so you have to be able to embrace relating to the world in a healthy, productive way through, say, brotherly love or charity, in order to be able to hold that state of freedom. So it's not that love is the child of freedom. They're one and the same. Well, okay, but I've identified you as that which is the other, and you're an American, and I've noticed some reoccurring prudishness. So I tread on thin ice whenever I can. As insulting as that sounds, it's just a recognition of reality. But yeah, I totally agree with you. I think you're spot on, actually, if you want to know the truth. Any other questions, or do you have your own question? Oh yeah, I have a plethora of questions.
when you want to,
anything you ask, I try and bring it down out of the abstract into the concrete personal for people. So just be aware if I'm not answering it in the style that.
Well, I was going to ask you about Hegelian influences on your thinking, so maybe I'll just forego that one altogether.
Thesis, antithesis, and
yeah, I guess that one's out tossed out the window. What do you do with the concept of disagreement? Sometimes there are inhuman elements in the way people disagree with one another. And I don't mean to say that there's two sides to a coin. What I mean to say is sometimes people could be entirely succumb to propaganda, entirely succumb to programming, whether it's through the media or some late night comedian or some non-rational memes that are going around social media, or even just their social ratification of their suspicions. And so you have all of these non-rational, inhuman elements that are going into the thought process of people. That's not necessarily a human process where it's done via empathy or where it's done via reason. It's rather done via programming, which is more computer-esque. So how do you humanly engage when there's so many inhuman elements?
Well, there's a great quote by Marcus Aurelius that says, "What stands in the way becomes the way." Why not use it to our advantage? Why not turn it into a vessel for what we're talking about? Let me give you an example. So there's a gentleman, he's a psychoanalyst, famous, named Carl Jung from Switzerland. And he is famous for his theories on the unconscious and his psychoanalytical process and depth psychology, all of which, nobody knows this, all of which he attributes to 10 years that he spent doing a irrational process that's equivalent to like lucid dreaming with a pen in your hand that he calls active imagination. And then he went and spent the rest of his career rationalizing and backing into these truths that he knew to be true, but hadn't rationally or been able to justify them or logically produce arguments that could support them. And so he has been able to do something that has created incredible good for the world, but he did it through irrational means. And I think that the irrational is something that I wouldn't say is inhuman. I mean, dreams are irrational, but yet they're very human, right? Dreams are our secret inner language. It's like when I'm speaking to you, I'm speaking in English. When I'm speaking to my wife, I might speak in Swedish. When I speak to someone in Italy, I speak their language, but your dreams speak your language and they're your symbols. And nevertheless, that irrational process of your dreams, of the whole unconscious, can be used in the same way. Let me give you an example. So I had a dream, and if you just write out your dreams, the amount of personal growth that can come out of that, a lot of this issue driving the polarization and the alienation is actually an unconscious process. It is irrational. And
you really are a Jungian. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Jung. He was accused of being a Nazi sympathizer during the war because he refused to subscribe to the idea that there was such a thing as a categorical evil in a man, that a person could be categorically all evil or categorically all good. He said it's ridiculous. People are free and they choose. And yet, had we grown up in his circumstance, we have no idea whether or not we would have grown up the same way. And there's an incredible truth here. And were it Jesus himself sitting in front of us, we would have denied him 1,000 times before a single cock had crowed. He believed that the people we horribilize and demonize, we not only cut ourselves off from being able to see ourselves in, we cut ourselves off from a part of ourselves as a potentiality. And it makes it more likely that it will drive us unconsciously and come out sideways because we're not in touch with that aspect of humanity ourselves. He believed that the Hitlers of the world and the terrorists and all that is an expression of humanity, just like all the saints and the people that we admire are. I had a dream once that in it, there were, well, I'll give you the conclusion of the dream. We're running short on time. The conclusion of the dream was I realized
that— Oh, you got 10 minutes.
Oh, fantastic. So I'm walking through this garden and there's these 3 trees, and I'm trying to make peace with an old friend. And I go up in this first tree. I'm trying to find the perfect place to make peace, right? And I stand up in this tree, and we raise this Native American peace pipe, right? Very dream language, isn't it? And we're about to light it to make peace, and all of a sudden, this bird just starts projectile vomiting out like crazy, like a cartoon. And we're like, oh, this is disgusting. We can't do this here. What is going on? And we leave. And we're like, that was unexpected. And we go into another tree. And in the second tree, this bird comes out of a nest and just starts bomb diving us at our heads. And we're like, make it stop. We can't make it stop. And we realize, wow, we leave. We had no control there. We go into a third tree, and the whole world disappears from out underneath our feet. And the whole tree disappears. And then eventually we're just suspended in space. And I climb down the tree, and I stand, and the earth is there. And I realize that the limb didn't have to hold, but it did. The ground didn't have to be there underneath my feet, but it was. And when it was, for the first time, it was a gift. And to be surrounded by gifts is to be rich. Rich, like we spend so much of our lives trying to stuff this hole in our hearts with all kinds of things that no quantity will ever suffice. And just being alive could come with the most intoxicating sense of wonder and gratitude. Intoxicating, like I've spent most of my life in college years getting extremely intoxicated, because sometimes life lacks that sense that just living can be intoxicating.
Yes.
It's that we are a gift. There's never been in the history of the universe anybody like you, and there never will be again in the history of the universe anyone like you. You are incredibly, infinitely unique. That makes you a gift. And because we are free, because everything we do freely through freedom, gives us the opportunity not just to receive everything as a gift, but to be a gift to others, to participate in the richness of life. That is, I can show up and be creative. I can show up and be destructive. I can show up and be nice. I can show up and be mean. I can show up any way. Life is an open-ended book for me. When a bug is born, it can fly because all of the actions of its whole life it will ever take are present at its birth through its heredity and genetics. When a deer is born, it can sprint. But when a human being is born, we are the most helpless creature on the face of the earth. Why is that? It is because we are born different than any other being on this planet, and that is with magnitudes more degrees of freedom. Freedom is not just who we are, it is what we do best. And all of this that I'm saying to you sounds so rational, but I did not arrive at it through rational means. I backed into it from a dream. So I say embrace the irrational, because it's going to be in the irrational world at which we're going to have to incorporate the unconscious drive that's causing this whole issue of projecting our devil onto other people and alienating ourselves from them. Carl Jung, the last quote that I'll leave you with on this topic: until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate.
Do you have, sorry, I just have to roll back. Until we make the unconscious conscious. Say that one more time.
Until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. And that's what's happening.
Okay, so there's this sort of a Kierkegaardian, you have to move into an element of free will in your life.
When you are...
You take self-ownership over the forces that are governing you.
Yeah. I mean, like, if you are a public speaker, when I do public speaking workshops, and you have a crutch, you have a tick, your leg shakes or something, it's unconscious. You're not conscious of it. What I make people do is I make people do it consciously on purpose and exaggerate it to incorporate it into their conscious awareness before they can, and then it gives them the opportunity to change it. But if you're not aware you're doing it and you're not aware of it, then you can't change it. And most likely there's something deep going on there. Maybe the only strategy people have is to go to personal attacks and ad hominems and all this stuff that's causing this problem. They don't have any better solutions. In which case, there's something very benign behind it. People care about causes. They do. And if they just have illegitimate tools to use, then we just need to give them better ones. But they have to connect to that unconscious intention behind it first, because you can't kill it. You can't get rid of the impulse to contribute to society or to advance the things you care about. It's very human. It's called purpose.
Let me ask you this as a practical question. In the midst of the conversation, is there a preference for truth or love? So supposing you have a relationship with someone familial or professional or what have you, and there is the freedom to disagree, but they're still very passionate about an issue, anything, feminism, economics, religion, and they're saying something that you know to be untrue, something just factually incorrect. Maybe even if you disagree with them, but it's still factually incorrect.
Factually, like climate change, factually, like, I mean, we say a lot of things are facts in the sense of like these events happened, but at the same time, I think there's also the importance to have the humility that no human being could ever have the whole picture.
But we do have an apperception of some facts.
Of reality, yes, it's important to be able to make observations.
So if they're so passionate about something that is just not so, for example, that capitalism has increased poverty globally.
Yes, exactly.
Which is just not the case.
Sure. Yes. So somebody says that, and you're like,
but there's
completely false. What do I do? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So do you have a preference in that case for truth or love, cultivating the relationship? How do you approach it in that sort of a situation?
Serving over pleasing. That's true love, I would say. So I don't think love and truth is an either or. I think it's a false choice. I think love requires truth. It requires reality. The difference is how deep do you want to go? Because the statement, if you are just sitting at the intellectual level, then you're dealt with a statement, and statements are true or they're false. It's binary. It's like we're in a computer dealing with zeros or ones of a program, right? We're in the matrix. But here at the deeper level, there's probably something behind that they care about, a value, a principle, something, an experience. And that experience is very true. That intention could be great. And in fact, you may even agree with it and be aligned with it. So if you can take the intellectual statement down to the level of their values, what do they care about, what their experience is, then you can find a deeper goal, a deeper common ground, and create a third win. And then you can have a conversation about how to get there in the same way that Arthur Brooks talks about how parents that have disagreements about how they should raise their children is a wonderful disagreement to have. They have the same goal of loving and raising their children. And we could have the same thing, but we have to drop down, not discard the intellect, but drop down and include the heart as well as the head. And that is a completely different conversation.
How would you begin to approach a conversation like that, where it's necessary for the sake of goodness, for the sake of love, for the sake of ameliorating the plight and the suffering of people that's going on all around the world, whether it's environmental or poverty or what have you? How do you begin to have the conversation with somebody so you recognize their intention, if I'm hearing you correctly, and you recognize their passion, and their passion is geared towards something that's positive, hopefully.
Confirm it.
Yeah, you confirm it. And where do you go from there?
Confirm it. Well, you start the conversation there, and you share and you connect on that until you've built a commonality around it. And then you can talk about your two different approaches to the same problem that you both care about. I'll give you a case in point. So a few weeks ago, we were in South Carolina and we were doing some coalition building, and I met with a particular party at the county level, and we sat down to talk about building a broad-based coalition around criminal justice reform. And the issue was civil asset forfeiture. But while we're sitting there, the person who we're speaking with, the head of this party, looks across the table and says, "Who are your donors? Where does the money come from? You know, the issue of dark money, it's a big deal. And I want to know that we're able to trust you because there's a lot of astroturf going on."
They're not wrong.
And basically, she's accusing us that if we have any donor that she doesn't like or trust, that all of a sudden we're doing something malicious, right? Just totally false. It's a terrible premise. But if I sit here and argue with her about that, then we're going to go back and forth all day. I got 30 minutes before I go. This is a really bad deal to stay at the intellectual level. So I say, I think what you're talking about is the issue of cronyism, right? You're talking about the issue of essentially corporate welfare and cronyism. Yeah. First of all, I got to say, This is my number one issue. I care about getting rid of cronyism more than anything else in the world. Right now, when 2/3 of every dollar that every American pays into the federal government in the form of income tax goes to 200 of the largest corporations in America in the form of a handout and a corporate subsidy, this is undermining the legitimacy not just of the institution of business, but the institution of government at the same time. This is huge. So I totally get where you're coming from. Yeah. And actually, let me tell you what we're doing to advance cronyism. So I talked to her about advance cronyism, advance stopping cronyism. Yeah. Once we have that conversation, we have trust. Now we can talk about it's when people don't have any objection and that they're not interested that you really have a problem. When people come to you with an objection, they have something they care about greatly. And actually, it turned out for this lady that I confirmed that her issue was something I really cared about too.
Okay, yeah, for sure. So you can build a commonality.
You can also interrogate reality. Hey, how are we doing on time?
You know what? We better wrap it up as soon as possible. Actually, we're a little bit over. But Nick, any sort of concluding thoughts? This has been excellent.
Thank you very much for your time. If you get a chance, you are free to join us at standtogether.org, learn more about us. And we work to equip citizens with the tools and skills to make a difference, specifically around advancing freedom beyond just voting and paying your taxes.
Excellent. Well,
thank you for letting me be here.
No, it's the pleasure's been all mine. Believe me on this. This has been terrific, Nick. Thank you for coming, and thank you for sharing some of your pearls of wisdom with us.
You bet. Take care.
All right. All the best. Oh, I'm still live. I think up next we have who do we have? We have Raptor Scott Zimmerman and Caleb Salvatore. We will try to make you laugh. So I
hold on just a minute
5
there,
minutes.
buddy.
All the best. Thank you. Now,
wait, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh.
Well,
I wasn't sure this was working.
Dan, what am I doing here? Am I talking comedy? Am I talking with Kate Prather? What am I doing?
So we were doing so well, you guys. We were doing so well. Everything was so perfect, and then like everything started getting fucked up. So there was an interview going on Channel A with Chrissy Witchers, and something. It wasn't her internet that went out, but somehow she got kicked out of StreamYard, and they won't let her back in. She was talking about Monsanto, so we have like all kinds of conspiracy theories brewing. But yeah, and then we flipped this with the other one. So Kate is actually going to be joining here next in just a couple minutes. And because of that, we don't have the appropriate intro title to roll for the next couple minutes. So
why don't you and I just make conversation, pleasant conversation?
Yeah.
Dan, who the hell are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Oh, I said, who the hell are you? I don't know you.
Oh.
You're running for president.
My hearing's a little off because I'm mixing up who's and how's and here's and wows and
wow.
Yeah. This is I'm running for president. I'm running for president of the United States from Mexico.
What brought you to Mexico?
A plane?
More specifically, because I spend a lot of my life in the Cayman Islands as well, which is obvious why I would, because I live in Canada. But
I want to learn more about that because that's Caribbean, right?
Yeah, not too far from Cuba. Economically, as far away from Cuba as you could possibly imagine, but geographically, not too far from Cuba. But
see, if only the communists weren't so communist, they'd have all of our technological advances like maps. And they'd know where the Cayman Islands were. No, I'm kidding, of course.
Well, they would.
Yeah. And they would have had more powerful ships and been able to go take over the other country. But of course, they wouldn't have cared about taking over other countries. Well, I don't know. That's hard to say. The United States is kind of capitalist, and they like taking over countries.
Yeah, that's not where they're so capitalist, though, is it?
Right. It's
they need to upgrade their capitalism to
stop
Cayman
being such
Island
a purist, man. Stop being America's not capital enough for you. Oh,
not true libertarians, no true Scotsman.
Yeah, no. Well, this was really interesting because this came up so many times this weekend. We're going to talk more about this Because we've got a little wind up session we're going to do tonight at 9:00 Eastern. We'll talk more about this, but there was some really interesting conversations that were going on that just happened to come up about like purity tests and it was really interesting. Did you see Robin Corner yesterday?
No, I didn't.
Oh, it was amazing.
Everyone kept raving about it. So it's one of those ones. Are the videos uploaded yet? Because I'd like to check out some of them, especially my good friend Mikey Wong. I said I'd check out his, because I was doing a host while he was going, and I wanted to see his talk.
Yeah, that stuff's all on YouTube, but right now it's like all in like these big 6 hour chunks, 6.5 hour chunks, because that's how we roll.
Right.
Yeah, and YouTube's probably like crapping out right now. Like, what are these giant ass files that are in here? But yeah, they're up there. And then Sam Robb this morning, the Sunday morning preacher service, that was actually, and I like to say I'm an atheist Jew, and I thought that was absolutely fascinating what he had to say. So yeah, there were a couple of really, really amazing talks. I mean, I think all of them were awesome.
We've had some home runs. I have to say, the one I just did with Nick is very postmodern. Very I
was listening to most of that. I really liked where he was going in the beginning. He was talking about I guess controlling people as it relates to slavery, and you're if this person is just a machine to you, and you try to turn them into a slave, you're taking away their humanity and their person and just turning them into a machine to you.
Yeah.
I kind of lost where he was going with that because I got distracted, but I'm gonna have to go back and watch that one. But yeah, that was really, really interesting.
For sure. Yeah. And there was another one with L.K. Samuels last night. That was fantastic. That guy knows his history. He's actually trying to make the case that the Confederates were socialists. And the common element was always collectivism, whether it's racism or feminism or any sort of an ism. There's always a collectivist mentality of we belong to this group, you belong to that group, we're better, you're not. And it was just fascinating to see him trace that throughout history. Excellent talks. Dan, I got to say, I like what you put together here.
Yeah, this was really amazing. And imagine we'll be doing this in person next time. So we're looking forward to that. All right. It looks like we've got everybody here. Jessica is going to be hosting Kate.
Okay.
And we've got a really awesome talk coming up. So I guess without further ado, so long, Brandon. I'll see you in a little bit. And
take it away.
Jessica, welcome. This is going to be, I'm going to introduce you, and then you're going to introduce Kate. This is so wonderful because, like, welcome. How's it going? I haven't even talked to you all week.
No, it's going great. I've been an active listener, listening to both tracks of the festival. I especially enjoyed having our hostess and hosts in the mix. My favorite talk so far is when I was able to host Justin Amon earlier today, learning about parenting with adventure and whatnot. That's some libertarian stuff I can definitely get in line with.
Awesome. Yeah, that guy's awesome also. All right. Well, I'm going to disappear and I'm going to bring in Kate. I'll see you a little bit later.
Hey.
Hey.
We finally getting everything set up and ready to go.
Hey, you've been doing a great job, an amazing job, not just for the festival.
Uh-oh.
Texas, you're the treasurer.
We're having connection issues all over the place.
Yeah, I know.
Is Dan's back?
I am. You dropped out for a second, but I'm going to disappear again. Hold on.
Oh, Okay, so we were talking about how you are the treasurer for LP Texas, the vice chair for Franklin County, and the event. In 2020, Taxation is Theft Fest, And then recently, I just was able to purchase a skirt from you. You're a fashion designer for Lib. Let's see. So you're definitely going to turn your heads in the name of freedom. Kate has a lot of personal here today to numbers that she's had since she was 18 years old. She believes that including written consent in personal relationships make for stronger bonds. I think a lot of us are extremely interested on this topic. Freedom lovers, please enjoy Kate Prather.
Thanks, Jess. Love you, girl. Can't wait to see you soon in person. Give you a hug. So the talk is going to be about Two's Company, and damn it, government's a crowd. They keep crowding us, and I'm trying to screen share, so just give me a minute. There we go. It's not allowing me to do what I want to do. Great. I have my presentation and screen like ready to go, and
Did
then
you try
this happens.
turning it off and turning it on again?
Ha 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 ha. And no, it's saying Firefox won't let me do it.
Oh.
You and I have already done this. Like, we went through rehearsal and it was fine, but
Okay, just tell me and I'll draw it on the screen as we go.
No, it's okay. I can do it without it. Not a problem.
You sure?
It's just, yeah, it's just fun
All
with
right.
visuals. So anyway, so everyone's heard the phrase, two's company, three's a crowd. And if you don't already know what that phrase means, it's basically when you have two lovers who want to enjoy their time together. You don't want that third person there. You don't want that third wheel. Well, government has forced themselves into being the third wheel of any relationship since the 16th century, basically. So what I wanted to start out with is we're accepting of relationships and what they look like. It doesn't matter if they're same sex, multiple partners, heterosexual, to name a few, just, people recognize. And, there is one thing we could do without, and that's government in our relationships. So I would like to update the classic phrase to two's company, government's a crowd. So in this chat, I'm really hoping you'll find the options that I present will give you more confidence in creating your own marriage contracts and denying government intrusion into your relationships. We know that government tries to poke their nose in our business since the invention of government. History is a really good lesson on that, and that's one of the reasons why we'll get to that in just a second. But before we can talk about the history, we got to talk about the intrusion of government. Look at some of these, or listen to some of these ridiculous marriage laws. One, Vermont wives need husbands to give written permission to purchase dentures. Yeah, crazy. In the town of Truro on Cape Cod, the groom-to-be must prove his manliness before marriage by hunting and killing either 6 blackbirds or 3 crows. First cousins are allowed to marry in Utah only if they are over 65 years old. It is illegal to smooch your wife in public on Sundays in Hartford, Connecticut. So those are some of the most ridiculous marriage laws. And the reason why I wanted to bring that up is because we think those are pretty ridiculous. Anybody who hears that is like, why is that even there? We don't need those. It's our relationship. I know Joseph wants to smooch me in Hartford, Connecticut on a Sunday in public. I'm pretty sure that's what he would want to do. He's not going to be looking around for a cop, right? So, and we know that women, thousands of women, are running out to get their husband's permission to get a new set of pearly whites. So we know that that's not happening, and that all that's outdated. Well, marriage, government in marriage is outdated. It should be done away with. Absolutely gone. We have had these fights about marriage equality and opening up marriage, but what we haven't had the conversation is getting government out of there. I mean, people have talked about it, but they don't really know what we can do besides try to fight. And why are you going to, if government's not going to give away power that makes them money and ensures their intrusion and their involvement in your daily life, because we all set up relationships in our life. That's just how we operate. So we're going to go into some of the history with this. So we're going to go back in time to before the 16th century and how were marriages validated. They were validated by common law marriage. Whether it was, two lovers wanting to get married and just declare themselves married, then that's how it worked. Their families would validate and confirm the marriage. Obviously, with more powerful and wealthy marriages, it was a very awkward time to be a virgin bride, because on your wedding night, you had your family and his family in the bedroom with you to watch it consummate. It's insane to think about that now, but for hundreds of years, that's what they did. And that's what they did to validate marriage. And they didn't have a lot of records, so they had to have witnesses. And, again, we think this is ridiculous. So later on in the mid 16th century, we start getting government and churches getting involved because more and more people are becoming literate. They're able to write and read, so they want to keep their own documents for their stuff. So churches and governments, magistrates, created marriage certificates. Not necessarily for the most common people. It really happened for wealthy and powerful people, because assets were being exchanged between families. Wives were property. We already kind of know the basis of that history. So that's what it came about. But those were certificates. Nobody was granted permission from the church or the government to get married. It was all up to the two parties getting married or their families, if the parties were involved in an arranged marriage. So what did all the common people do? They just coupled up, had a ceremony, and then declared publicly, this is my husband, this is my wife. Common law marriage. There was no certificate. There was really no need because common people didn't have many assets. So when we get in, we think about that, we're like, well, that's perfect. Why can't we do that now? So we're going to fast forward, and we're going to fast forward to the mid 19th century. Okay. A lot of horrible laws came right after the Civil War / War of Southern or Northern Aggression. So you see these laws happening to, gun control laws started out that way to prevent blacks and freed slaves from defending themselves. And you have the same thing happening with marriage licenses. Marriage licenses then became invented to prevent interracial couples from marrying. As freed slaves were introduced into society after the Civil War, you had more people who were able to actually get into relationships that did not stay within their race. But we know that certain areas in the United States didn't like that because it was against what they believed to be right. We all know now that is wrong, and we don't do that anymore. But the idea of marriage licenses has continued, right? Why haven't we got rid of them? If we realize that interracial marriage is okay now, and it has been for decades, I say decades, because we haven't quite gotten to a whole century of that being okay yet, which is really upsetting. But so why do we still have them? Well, when governments found that they could not only control the interracial marriage relationships, they also realized they could keep same-sex partners from declaring being married in public. Because it got to the point towards the later 19th century, early 20th century, there was more and more a little bit more openness of homosexual, and then we have polygamy coming on as well. And they didn't want these people to just declare themselves husband and wife. So what they ended up doing is they invalidated common law marriage. And they said There will be no more common law marriage. You must go to your local magistrate and you must go through these hoops to jump through in order to receive this marriage license. Then you can get married. And then when you get married and you run through all the hoops, you come back and we'll give you a certificate and you're certified. But you can't be married and you can't claim husband or wife until that happens. Not only did they prevent or like wanted to put their own moral stamp and standard on what marriage looked like, they also wanted to make a profit. It's a good business to run when you realize every single person on the planet is going to usually couple up because we're not really loners. The majority of us are going to get married at some point. And if you start to educate people and force them into these, in order to get benefits, you have to get married, they're going to make it into a business. And so that is what they've kind of run with. And that's why we're still seeing marriage licenses today. And after all of it's been over a century, it's been almost 2 centuries, or wait, hold on, where are we at? Yeah, it's been around 2 centuries of marriage licenses. And with all of those generations finding that to be normal and what you do, then that's what we're ingrained. It's like, think about it. If you've been married before, if you're getting into a relationship, the first thing you think about is, I've got to schedule a day off to go to the county clerk's office. And I've got to submit my application. And I've got to sit down and answer these questions. And I've got to wait in an office. And I've got to jump all these hoops because my dad did it, my mom did it, my grandparents did it, so on and so forth, right? So we have become, it's just kind of what's been ingrained in us. So let me see where I'm at right here. Sorry, with my slides, it's a little bit easier. So we get into how the federal government, now we're going to fast forward to the 21st century, right? This is actually quite new. Freedom for same-sex unions happened in 2015. So they had fought for their right to get married and have a license and a certificate. We'll get to that in a little bit, why I think that was a bad idea. But we are seeing that our norms of putting a moral stamp on what a marriage looks like is fading away. People are becoming more free to choose what their relationships look like, whether it's multiple partners, same-sex partners, interracial, it doesn't matter. We get to think it's our relationship. We get to decide what it looks like. So that's kind of the history of the of marriage licenses. So why did I bring up the history? Well, there's a few things that you heard me say in our history, and I'm going to define the 4 types of unions. So first off, we have the marriage license. It's a and this is the definition: a document issued by church or state authority authorizing a couple to marry. Now, let me read that again so it soaks in. A document issued by a church or state authority authorizing a couple to marry. So, marriage certificate. Document bearing the details of when and between who or where a union took place. Document bearing the details of when and between who a union took place. So that's a certificate. That happens after the marriage, or the wedding, I should say. So common law marriage, you heard me say this in the very beginning of the history. Informal marriage by habit and repute, or marriage in fact, declared public. Domestic partnership. This is a new one, just now getting to it. 2 persons engaging in intimate relations, sharing resources, can be without lawful recognition. Now, these are the definitions of unions that we all hear, and they actually get a little bit more complicated because government has really complicated. They kind of got a step ahead of everybody with this, because again, when you realize that everybody is going to get in a union and you want to make it a big business, you're going to do everything you can to make sure that business keeps running. So keep in mind those definitions of unions. So those are your options. All right, your options. Now I'm going to talk about the options you have with less government interference to almost no government interference. And again, that all depends on what you choose and what you and your partner consent to. So the main two I'm going to be talking about, though, is domestic partnerships and common law marriage. Reason why is because as libertarians, anybody who's watching this, you already know that marriage licenses are bad and marriage certificates are pretty much bad because now they're associated with marriage licenses. All right. So domestic partnerships. I wish I could show you this because here is an example. I have an example, unfortunately, on my screen that has a domestic partnership agreement. And you can Google it. It's very easy. Just Google domestic partnership agreement example, and it's going to pop up. In fact, that's what Joseph and I did when we did our domestic partnership agreement. We just Googled one, scrolled through, read through a few of them, and found what we liked. We changed up, any of the language we wanted to, added things, took away things, whatever we wanted, talked about it for like almost a whole day. And then at the end, we called my friend Barbie, who's a notary, and I was like, hey, I have this contract I need signed. And she's like, okay. She comes over and she's like, oh, so you're basically getting married. And I was like, yeah, we're basically getting married. So we sign our document. She notarizes it. She puts it in her book. And the reason why we did a notary is not because it's a government document. That is a contract. That is a document that is for us. And a notary helps to make that contract valid for us in case other people or either one of us wants to dispute that. So we can come back and say, this is what we agreed to. It has been witnessed and signed. You must stick with it. And we'll talk about that some more here in a little bit. But if you are interested in domestic partnership agreements, one thing you could do is, yes, you could Google your own and use that as a reference. But if you're looking into getting insurance benefits through your spouse's company, they usually will have a domestic partnership contract available for you. So you can kill two birds with one stone. Grab their domestic partnership contract, change it however you want, or sign it, notarize it, send it over to them, then take that same one, change it up however you want, and then use that one as your basis and foundation for your marriage. Now, here's the issue with these two. Domestic partnership is only recognized in the state that you declare the domestic partnership. It is not recognized outside the state. So in the state of Texas, our domestic partnership is recognized. It is not recognized anywhere else. It may be recognized in Oklahoma only because the domestic partnership contract has been filed with his company for insurance and benefits purposes, and they have two major headquarters, one in Texas, one in Oklahoma. Again, I'll actually have to look that up, but that is something that you can claim and argue if you want to try to fight the valid or uphold the validity of your domestic partnership. So before I really get into all this, I want to remind everybody, I am not an attorney. I do advise, though, you reach out to an attorney and have them explain like the differences between your jurisdictions, the states, and just because even though you're trying to get government out, you really want to make sure you are going to keep government out as much as possible. So the best thing to do if your own research isn't getting the results you want, reach out to an attorney. Because if you write up a contract on your own and you don't do enough research, chances are your contract could be invalid. So I've gone through state marriage. I was divorced. I went through the whole marriage with the certificate and the license and the questions and sitting down going, are you sure the person you intend to marry is not your second cousin or first cousin? And you have to sit there and you're like, what the hell, right? But you're so star-crossed and in love, you kind of don't care about how ridiculous the ridiculousness of what you're having to go through. And it just kind of hits you, but you're like, I don't care. I get this piece of paper, I rush off, I want to make sure that my wedding is perfect, my dress, my hair, my makeup, my husband is going to have the perfect tux, just everything else is going on. You don't think about all that. I've been there. And boy, was that a mistake. Not only did I get divorced, but at the same time, I don't feel like my relationship had the foundation. There was other things going on there, but we're not going to get into that. So why am I talking about domestic partnerships and common law marriage? I'm currently in a domestic partnership that has turned common law. Now, common law marriage is you basically declare that you are husband and wife. You can have a ceremony, you don't have to have a ceremony. I highly recommend, though, you have a written contract. Reasons why I'm mentioning this is because I think it's a really great foundation for your marriage, for your relationship. Whether you're going into a domestic partnership, because you kind of have to have a contract anyway, or if you go into common law marriage. Reason why is not just because if something were to happen, you already have everything written down, kind of like a prenup. A lot of people think contracts, especially marriage contracts, they think prenups, and they think, oh, only the rich and the wealthy and the powerful and the celebrities need those. No, that's not the case. Anybody can get it. It's actually quite cheap. You can do it yourself. If you are very confident and you know what you're doing, you can write a contract yourself. I mean, contracts can't have been held up with somebody writing an agreement on a napkin and both signing it. Like, that is a contract. Oral contracts happen too. I don't recommend oral contracts though, because they're not as strong as on piece of paper and having witnesses. Okay. So why write it down? Why write it down? Things happen. You're in love, it's new, you think nothing but rainbow and sunshine and puppy dogs and the new house and potentially having kids and growing old together and all the beautiful things that happen in your relationship. Fast forward a few years, you get into a really big argument or somebody messes up. They may not have intended to, or they might have. We don't know. Not any two relationship is the same. Not any two breakup is the same. So if you have it written down and you have the tough conversations while you're in love, it's easier to have those harder conversations. You're actually more open to listening to your partner, and you're open to being honest and have a lot more integrity. If you have it written down and you get into an argument, you already have that foundation of what you would do in that event written down. Because people can say in the height of emotion, they're going to do or they're going to say something. And then fast forward, and they might still remember that, or their partner might remind remind them that you've made that promise. But you can throw it in their face and be like, oh, I didn't say that, or, I don't, I'm just gonna, to be a dick or a really, a bitch, like, you can just go off and say, no. And that happens a lot. And that's when we get into nasty divorces. We get into people lying and cheating and, just really nastiness. And it's because you don't have really a big foundation on how to navigate those muddy waters. So, sorry, I keep saying so. My husband was like, don't say so a lot. This is the first time I've given this presentation, so it'll be.
You love to sew, Kate.
I do love to sew. All right, so going back, see, did it again. Domestic partnerships and common law marriage. Because you are not offering an invitation to government to complicate your union, there is no record that grants them permission to be involved in your relationship. There are many benefits to choosing a domestic partnership and common law marriage. You and your partner define the details of your union. Nobody else does. It's between you, and it's got to be consensual. Those details can be having kids, financial responsibilities, financial division of property ownership, assets, debt management, loans, relationship roles, And one of the funniest things my husband brought up was, who gets the dog? So we have all of these things that can go into your contract that that go into your contract that becomes the written foundation for your relationship. A lot of these things we talk about anyway, and most of the time we agree on it, especially in the beginning. But things can change. You go off and you decide you want to buy a new house. You have separate finances. How does that purchase look like? Well, if you've already talked about separate finances, then you've already talked about the possibility of having a big purchase and how that is going to, look on paper and how it's going to be divided. You can reference that if you forget. Chances are you won't, because your contract is very special. It's a part of you. It's a part of us. It's something that we hold very dear. It's the description of our union. We have, let's see. So with again, it can be tedious trying to write down, thinking, I don't need to write down everything that I'm talking about in my relationship. We should just have the intention, the integrity, the devotion to each other to just live up to our word. We see with divorce rates, that's not happening. As much as we would love for it to, it's just not happening. So how do we get back into strengthening our relationships? Write it down. Have those tough conversations, but you cannot write it down until you sit down and have that conversation. So let me give you an example of what that conversation can look like. You want to talk about, let's see, debt. Everybody right now, a lot of people are in debt. So we want to talk about debt. Now, you can have this conversation in the beginning of your relationship before you have a contract. It's kind of easier, again, because you're more open, you're devoted, you're honest, you want to please your partner, but at the same time, you want to be true to yourself. In that new relationship, it's easier. You can still do these things and create your contract in the middle of an already established union, whether it's a marriage or domestic partnership, long-term relationship. However, you can start this process at any time. And you sit down and you want to talk about debt, and it's kind of hard to want to talk about that, right? Because a lot of people are going to probably start fighting about finances and debt. A lot of people do. Unfortunately, that leads to a lot of divorces. So you say, hey, honey, I would really like to talk about our debt and how we're going to manage that in the future and what that looks like. When do you have time to sit down and talk about it? You do not talk about it right then and there. You don't, because you've just put your partner in a corner and they are not mentally or emotionally prepared to have that conversation, because it's a tough conversation. Any tough conversation can go this way. And you say, but before you leave that question, you work out a date and time where you are going to sit down, just the two of you, no kids around, no distractions, no phone. And you say, we're going to talk about it at this date, at this time, preferably around 2 days after you ask the question. Give your partner enough time to do their research, to feel comfortable in having the conversation, get their emotions worked out and how they want to approach it. So you sit down, you have this conversation. You let both people talk about not only their ideas, but how you feel about those ideas. You do not scream and yell. If you feel like you're going to start screaming and yell or you're getting frustrated, agree at the beginning of that conversation to take like a 5-minute break, go to separate rooms, take a breath, and then come back together. You must finish that conversation. If you can't finish a tough conversation, how are you going to finish marriage? Right? It's just, it's going to be hard. So you got to have those tough conversations. We're spending the rest of our lives together. That's decades, right? That's decades. So we got to make it happen. So take the time, have those hard conversations, write them down. When you come to an agreement, write them down. Now, the reason why I say write them down, you don't have to have all of these conversations before you sign your initial contract or your domestic partnership agreement. You can have a basis of your contract saying, on this day, in love and devotion and total faith, we enter into this contract. Addendums and amendments, to be referenced later. So you have that, you sign it, you're married. Okay, that's your relationship. You've done that. Then you can go back and you can add addendums or amend anything in the contract you want as long as it's consensual. All right. If both parties have to agree on it. So we got a dog. And that's, again, we already had our domestic partnership contract, and we had all these addendums that are a part of our contract that deal with debt and division of assets, different finances. Like, we have separate finances. I have my own bank account. He has his own bank account. My kids have their own bank account. So we all have different stuff. We do not really have access. He doesn't have access to mine or my kids' accounts. I don't have access to his. It's total integrity. But that is our relationship. That may make a lot of you cringe, and that's okay. But that is something that we are both very, very comfortable doing. And so that's what an addendum looks like. It's basically a topic of discussion and then an agreement that you write down. So you can add an addendum. We got a dog after we signed our contract, and he asked the question, who's going to get the dog? Well, I'm going to get the dog. Well, I don't know. I named the dog, so I want the dog. Well, she thinks I'm the pack leader, so I'm going to get the dog. So you have that conversation, and you sit there, and once you get to an agreement, you write it down, and you don't even have to sign it. You just write it down, and you add it to your agreement, your initial contract, your initial agreement, and you cite it on the back of that contract or in the front of it, however you want, and say, this is addendum B/1, or just, addendum dog. It's however you want to, however you want to name it. So you just, any conversation you have, you write it down and you agree to it. Oh, let me see. So we've already done the contracts, and now we're going to get into what happens if you want to dissolve the relationship. Chances are you probably, if you're going to go through this route, you're going to talk about what happens. What happens if we can't make it work? And it's reality. We don't want to have that conversation. We don't want to shatter that dream, but we have to have it. It's reality. Again, almost 50% of relationships end in divorce. So just because you have a domestic partnership and a common law marriage doesn't mean you're not part of those statistics. It's just relationships fail. And you have that as a reference. So you've already talked about your division of assets in your contract. You talked about who's going to get the dog. The other thing you could talk about is what that looks like. If you were like, you know what, if I want to get out of the relationship, but he doesn't, then we are going to agree that we have to go to 12 joint counseling sessions over 12 weeks before the contract is dissolved. Now, if we both come together and agree that we want to dissolve the contract, then we dissolve the contract. We go to the addendums and we separate our debts, our finances, our assets, everything, like so. We've already had those tough conversations. We already know how that looks. It makes it very easy, makes it pain-free. Here's the problem with the division of that contract. In a domestic partnership and a common law marriage, unfortunately, you still have to file for divorce. And that's where I was telling you, government has made sure they are going to stay in business one way or another. If you are in a domestic partnership or a common law marriage and your contract is dissolved, there's paperwork that has your and your husband's name on it. Let's say you buy a house together after your contract. You have it in there. You're both 50-50, right? Then you dissolve the marriage. If you don't file for divorce and you want to sell that house, what happens? The government isn't going to recognize that Kate owns 50% of that house and Joseph owns the other 50%. They will come after you, especially if I keep the house and an accident happens on my house and I get sued. Like, he's up for it too. So it's actually in his best interest to file for divorce to make sure he is not associated with that asset. And that could be anything. That's just one example. So unfortunately, government got smart, and it doesn't matter if it's a common law marriage, a domestic partnership, or a traditional licensed marriage. Chances are you are going to have to go and file for divorce. Filing for divorce can be pretty easy, and it can be cheap if You have a contract already in place. In fact, once you file for divorce, you do not have to have a judge agree on anything, really. You can hire a mediator and you can say, here's our contract, here's the mediator, we're going to mediate. If there's any disputes, that's what happens, that's what you agree to. You can actually put that in your contract when you initially sign it. In the event of a dissolution, we are going to use a mediator. And that's what you do. You've already made that choice. So things to consider with that: the couples who do marry under common law are likely to have their marriage recognized in all states under common law. It's called the full faith and credit rule of the U.S. Constitution, where sister states recognize marriage made valid under another state's law. Common law marriage is considered marriage if you do one of these things: file joint taxes, married jointly. Even if you're in a domestic partnership, if you go into a domestic partnership agreement and then you file taxes married jointly, you will then automatically become common law married in the state's eyes. If you do not want to upgrade, or really kind of downgrade at some point, depending on what you think, your domestic partnership, you need to have it in writing that you will not declare this relationship to be common law. That is not your intention. So if it is written that it is not your intention, it has to stay a domestic partnership. And then do not file your taxes married jointly. Domestic partnerships are only recognized in the state where the union took place and is not recognized as a marriage. We saw that before same-sex marriage ended up receiving marriage licenses and certificates. So that is where that came from. All right. So some of the things that you can do to normalize government-free, government-less marriage. Teach people or talk to people about not running off and going get that marriage license. Look at how you want to define your relationship, and sorry, I'm looking at my slide. Realize that there can be options other than the government, license. Encourage personal contracts between consenting adults. Almost in any relationship. I have some contracts with my parents. I've had contracts with my parents since I was 18. There's one contract that I can go into detail later, but one contract I do not have their permission to talk about. So we can get into that later and what that looks like as well. Have the tough conversations. If you have the tough conversations and you write them down and you have an agreement, chances are you're going to really strengthen that marriage, whether you're already legally married, or I should say lawfully married, or legally married. There is a difference. If you have that strong foundation, then chances are you won't need to dissolve or get a divorce. And then you really do have a government-free marriage. If you go into common law, if you go into domestic partnership, and you have those foundations and you don't dissolve the contract or get a divorce, you have taken government out of your relationship. You have now defined it because you never gave government permission to come into your marriage. So contracts can be amended at any time. They are binding. A lot of people find that contracts are binding, but you get to decide how fluid or rigid they can be. You can amend them at any time if that is what both parties want to do. Or you can stick to it and say, you know what? No, I like how it is. We can keep it short and sweet, or we can go off the basics and I don't want to add anything. But that, again, has to be an agreement between the two of you. It lasts forever, so you can change it at any time. Whether you get into a new purchase or something else happens. The reason why I really love the contracts is when you create a relationship contract, is the duty of both parties to make sure both have an equal voice in its creation. And most importantly, you're honest, and enter into the agreement with devotion and love. And if you have that as your foundation with your contracts, then it's going to be easier to have those tough conversations. And if you have a couple tough conversations, it's going to be even easier to have more tough conversations when they arise, or arguments when that happens. So don't feel shame if you've done what other people have done and have gotten a marriage license and got the marriage certificate. It's okay. You can still build that foundation by writing down and starting your contract now, your relationship contract now. It could be anything. It could be, again, your debts, your assets. It could be about kids. If you decide you want to have kids in the future, you can even talk about, if this is something that you want, is the child going to have his last name, her last name, or both last names? It's anything you want to talk about. Write it down. And it doesn't have to be a massive, 5-page document on the topic. It can just have a couple sentences. We agree to this in the event of this. Great. We agree. Sign, there. It's done. It does not have to be complicated. It is not a complicated thing. You can do it just with a little bit of research. By researching and practicing more independence, by creating or introducing contracts into your marriage, you'll find that you reclaim most of the responsibility in your marriage and have no need to invite government into your relationship. For those who are looking at marriage, I hope you feel you've taken away some of the options discussed and talk more with your partner. Defeat the statistics, strengthen your union with a written agreement. No matter how your marriage looks currently or in the future, give liberty a boost by telling government they've crowded your relationships long enough. And that, guys, is Two's company. Government's a crowd.
You're darn right, Kate. Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation.
It's a new one.
Yeah, it's a good one. We have one question from the comments. Viewers want to know if there's an easy way to get a basic or a common contract without having to engage lawyers in the beginning. And I know that you mentioned to maybe just Google something.
Yes, that's what we did. Joseph and I, when we got our domestic partnership agreement, we Googled it. We did. We just Googled it. We went through, we scrolled, and they're usually just one page. They're just one page. And they talk about just the basics of you are entering into this union faithfully with devotion. It really does. It has sappy language, which is great because that's what you want, right? In your marriage contract, you want lovey and sappy and commitment, and that's what it looks like. And you can add whatever you want. We added in ours the whole 12 weeks, 12 joint counseling sessions. So we added that. That was not there. So again, you can add and make it yours. So
that's a good addition. I think people should consider that if you're going to
absolutely
statistics like you're saying, let's build in something into our contract that's going to fortify us in our times of weakness, it seems. Kate, I had a question. I wonder whether you're going to use a contract that already has a language or whether you're going to create your own. Is it a good idea to bring in a mediator or someone that you trust that's going to help you to see other sides of any parts of these agreements?
Yes, if you are having a hard time starting the contract, then you can have a trusted person. It could be a parent, it could be a friend, like your best friend. It could be two best friends, to kind of help. It's however you want to do that. And yes, you can hire a professional mediator. I actually would recommend going the professional route because they've done it before. They know how to make sure people come together and reach an agreement that is consensual, amicable, and fair. Most importantly, fair.
Yes, and understanding at the time that you come up with a consensual and amicable and some fair agreements, what would you do if your partner and you have a dispute against the contract? You certainly don't want to bring the government in then.
Absolutely not. So we just talked about the mediator. That is the way I would recommend you would take that. If you cannot sit down and come to a conclusion yourselves, hire a mediator. They again know how to make sure both will come out happy. And it doesn't have to be, mediator doesn't have to be used to dissolve the contract. It could be used at any time. You could even use a joint marriage counselor to help you get to a conclusion. So it could be a mediator, it could be a professional counselor. That is what I would recommend if you're having a tough time and you're stuck on a particular part of your contract.
That's a good idea. And while you talked about how your contract basically is the description of your love's union, I thought that was really great. And I wonder if a lot of people, after a while, they may want to renew their vows, if you will, or maybe refreshing the contract. Is this something that you intend to do after you and Joseph have been in a consensual, non-government wedded bliss for quite some time?
Yeah, well, we haven't even had a wedding ceremony or anything. We decided to go ahead and have our contract, and we signed it, and that's kind of our special date. I don't know if we haven't really kind of talked about having a public ceremony or anything, but that can definitely happen. Again, the great thing about these contracts is you and your partner, or more partners, however that looks, again, you get to decide how your relationship is done and what it looks like.
Yes, and I think people, thank you, Sean McAllister, is saying to his company, government's a crowd. Thank you, honey. I wonder, you were talking about speaking to Joseph's company. I think you were talking about getting some health insurance, or if you needed to speak to the mortgage company or the insurance company. What are some of the paperworks that have been requested of you to show some validity of the contract that you have outside of government intervention?
Well, the first thing that they're going to ask for, if it's a company asking for it for like benefits and insurance reasons, they're going to have you look at their domestic partnership contract. They want you to sign that one. So we actually have two domestic partnership contracts. We have ours, and then we have his company's in order for me to receive spousal benefits. And that's what that looks like. They are going to ask for that contract, and then they are going to ask for it to be notarized, which means when you get it notarized, the notary verifies your identity when you sign that contract. So they have your IDs. So you don't have to send in any identification or anything. The notary has taken part of that. So really the domestic partnership contract is almost what you need, besides like social security numbers, because they're going to need that for insurance purposes.
Sure. And I think something that most people don't realize is you don't really need government permission to do so much together as a couple, like opening a bank account, for example. The bank wouldn't ask you for a marriage certificate in the first place.
Absolutely.
Kate, is there anything else you want to let us know about these contracts?
Let me think. The number one thing I hope you guys take away with this is no matter whether you're starting a relationship or have been in a long-term relationship, please write it down. Have those tough conversations, have those agreements, write it down, and enter into those contracts and those agreements with devotion and love and integrity and honesty. Because if you enter in that agreement with all of those things there, and that's just a small part, then you're going to be able to carry those values into your marriage a lot longer. I mean, you can have a piece of paper that says, oh, I have a date and we signed it and everything. I'm referring to a marriage certificate. And you look at it and you might go, oh, but if you have a contract, you have that and you're going to go, oh, but you're also going to be like, I remember having this tough conversation. And I remember like going to tears because I didn't want to think about the horrible situation that maybe something happens to Joseph, and I start crying and he gave me a hug. And that was a moment, that stuck with me. And I have that moment on a piece of paper. I have, us talking about the potential of having children and who's going to take whose last name or what does that even look like? And I have that right there is another piece of paper that is a memory. So I have this, even though it sounds complicated and just really boring, it's really not. Those are memories and agreements, and that right there shows our devotion to and our love to one another. And I really want that for everybody out there. I want that for everybody out there.
Yes, Kate, thank you. Thank you for wanting that for us. And like you said, if you really want your little certificate to make you say, "Oh, you can do the nice calligraphy like the state of Texas."
Exactly.
On there, nice.
Yeah, go to Etsy. If you want to pretty up your domestic partnership contract, go to Etsy, take your contract to them, be like, I want it to look pretty. Like, go do that.
feel like
It'd
this
probably be
is not
cheaper
a-
to do it through Etsy than actually go get a marriage license.
I think Liberty Couture is going to do domestic partnership announcements. Save the date.
Oh, I'm not really good with calligraphy. I could sew all day, but I'm not really great with calligraphy. Don't come for me with that.
Hey, thank you so much for giving your talk. And all you freedom lovers out there, thank you so much for watching. Hang in there. Coming soon, we've got Caleb, Raptor, and Mr. Z doing some libertarian comedy. Stay tuned.
Thanks.